Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I have a book review, and I must say, I have quite a bit of notes. So there's a lot to unpack. So we're just going to go ahead and dive in. So if you saw the thumbnail of the video and read the title, then you know which book I will be doing. And the book just recently came out. So it is Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth, which says, celebrated as Hollywood's architect of cool, Jay Sebring was murdered by the Manson family and slandered by the press. This book sets the record straight. And the authors are Terrill and Anthony DiMaria. So this is the book that we are going to unpack tonight. I will say, even though, like I said, I have a lot of notes, when I go through kind of each chapter, I do have some quotes that really resonated with me, and I wanted to go over that. But also when I make kind of like a point as the story's going along and as I'm going through the review, just keep in mind that as much as we'll be going over tonight, it's only a fraction of what you'll get in the book. The authors give so much information and context to everything that they discuss in this book. So if I'm just going through like one or two points, please know that the author goes in so much more detail with this. So you get a really clear picture of everything as the book unfolds. So with that being said, so in regards to the back cover of the book, so I did kind of type everything out. The back cover gives different quotes by different celebrities. So for example, Steve McQueen, Nancy Sinatra, Robert Wagner, Quincy Jones, Fred Siegel, Dominic Dunn, Paul Anka. So that's what you get on the back cover. Inside on the sleeves is where you get information on the authors, as well as a description of what you can expect when you read the book. So I will read that for you, and I did type that out. So it reads, in the glitz and glamour of 1960s Hollywood, Jay Sebring stood as an icon of innovation and style, a visionary who invented men's hair care and design concepts. Sebring wasn't just a hairstylist. He was the architect of a $100 billion a year industry. His revolutionary techniques and signature charm drew legends like Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, and Paul Newman to his chair, making him a trusted confidant to Hollywood's elite. From innocuous, I knew I was going to totally butcher that word, roots in Michigan to Hollywood's star among stars, Jay Sebring embodied the American dream. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, his extraordinary legacy was overshadowed by the horrifying Manson family murders. Instead of being remembered for his groundbreaking work and larger-than-life personality, the media painted Sebring as a symbol of Hollywood's so-called decadent distortion that served salacious narratives and tarnished his name. This untold story, now illuminated through exclusive insights from Sebring's family, collaborators, legal and forensic authorities, and criminal perpetrators, reveals the man behind the myth. Discover how Jay Sebring's influence lives on, shaping our culture in ways we often take for granted. It's time to reclaim his legacy from the shadows of his tragic end and celebrate the dazzling contributions that made him a Hollywood pioneer and historical figure. So I will say that description is spot on to what the authors go ahead and unfold throughout the entire book. And again, I feel like this description just so delicately touches on each point that it's going to make. And then throughout the book, really expands and gives a lot of detail through each of those. But it's absolutely spot on, I will say, for that. So in regards to, before we deep dive into the book, I want to say, so stay tuned until the very end of the show, because there will be a special announcement. So as I'm going through everything and revealing the book and kind of, again, giving my takes on some of the things that I read, anything that kind of stuck out to me, stay tuned. So stay tuned. So the book, right? Let's get to the structure of the book. It is quite big, and you can see that here. It is 557 pages, and y'all, there are 68 pages of black and white photos. Let me repeat that, 68 photos. And a lot of them, when I was going through them, I hadn't seen a lot of these photos. And I won't necessarily show them on camera. I'll just kind of quickly kind of go through, but they're spread throughout. And a lot of them, because it gives the credit of where these photos come from, so many of them were by the DiMaria family, which is just incredible that they gave so much to this book, like so much personal insights. And we'll get through that. And I'll expand more on that as I do the review. But there are so many just wonderful photos in here that really capture, again, not just Jay Sebring, but Jay throughout his entire life. And it's just, the photos really complement the work inside of the book. So with that being said, so it starts right away with Jay's own words. And that's the opening, which I thought was really powerful because, again, we're looking here to learn about Jay because there really isn't a ton out there, or what there is out there is just pretty much the same song and dance narrative that has been wrong for over 50 years. So having the book start out with Jay's words directly, I thought that was a really, really powerful way to start the book. And right away, it just grabbed me and kind of brought me into the book. So I'm like, okay, we're going for it right away. So the prologue, jumping to that, talks about how Jay Sebring had two lives. He had his rise to cultural icon and later as a victim of a horrific crime that goes down in American history because of the nature of the crime that it was connected to. So the kind of more second image of Jay Sebring is the one that kind of triumphs everything, including his own legacy. And his legacy, the authors describe, is someone who earned everything the American dream offers: fame, fortune, respect, and being the very best in the field. So it says, since his murder, Jay's reputation has been mutilated as his body. The press and a few backstabbing Hollywood associates played a huge part in that, printing rumor, innuendo, and outright falsehoods. And that is something that we do see later in the book as we get more into that. So it says, quote, Jay's story and the historical context surrounding these notorious martyrs need to be corrected. He was a man who led an extraordinary life in an extraordinary time. And until now, that's a tale that hasn't been told, end quote. So right away, before you even get to chapter 1, you get a lot of kind of setting up of here's what we're going to be discussing and here's why. And I will say, not everybody, I get it, like wants to necessarily always like read through like the prologues and the introductions. A lot of people just want to get to the meat of the book, which is always just chapter 1. And some books, depending on what you're reading, you know, maybe give a little bit of information, but then when you jump to chapter 1, that's where you get really into the book. Not in this case. You get going the second you hit the page where it's Jay's own words and then going through the epilogue and introduction. There's so much great information within that I would say if anybody is the type to just be like, I just want to go to chapter 1 and get going. No. like do yourself a service and start the very beginning, because there's so much info that you get before you even get to chapter 1. And another note that I have that I wanted to make sure I said kind of earlier on, as much information as there is in the book, there is so much information in the footnotes. So let me like try to get to one of the pages. Almost every single page has a type of, like, for example, I'm on page 382 here. You can see that there's a lot of information in a really long footnote. Again, not everybody stops and reads the footnotes. And if you're the type that, for example, listens to audiobooks, you don't get that information. I felt these footnotes that were in the book, I'm like, they didn't even need to be footnotes. They should have been in the core material because they were so important and you got so much out of that. So again, if you're someone that just kind of, skims through and you're like, I don't need to really read the footnotes, I just want to keep going on with the story. No. Make sure you read all of that because there's so much information. And there are some points in particular where when I was doing my notes, I'm like, this should have been up with the rest of the book. It's so important. Oh my gosh, I don't want that overlooked. So those were some moments that I had. So, all right, let's go ahead and jump into the book itself with chapter 1. So again, I'm just going to give a little bit of points through each chapter, but the authors give so much more information in each chapter as it goes along. So right away, the book starts with Tom from Michigan. So for those who don't know, Jay Sebring was born Thomas John Coomer. We learned a lot about Jay's family and his background. His father was Bernard and his mother was Margaret, and she went by Peg. So Bernard's father, Kurt, abandoned the family when Bernard was 3 years old, and their mother took her kids to live with her parents. So Bernard, Jay's father, had to kind of step up from a young age and help provide to the family with his mother. So he worked during the day and went to school at night. Peg, Tom's mother, was the 6th of 11 children, which I know now it's just like, oh my God, that's funny. But back then that wasn't uncommon. But again, she was the 6th of 11. On August 14th, 1932, Bernard and Peg were married, and their first child, Thomas, was born October 10th, 1933. In total, the couple would have 4 children: Thomas, Geraldine, known as Jerry, Frederick, known as Fred, and Margaret, known as Peggy. Quote, Bernard was strict, accurate, regimented, and blunt. He was a I knew I was going to butcher that. It's been a long day, y'all. No nonsense, old school parent, and there was no room for debate or thinking outside the box, end quote. So I like that with each kind of immediate family member, the book gives you not just a here's who they were, but a greater context and look into what were they like? What was the family dynamics like? And I really like that because you just got so much information that, at least for myself in reading this book, I was able to picture and see everything because I had so much information as a reader to work with. So that's one thing that we do see here with all of Jay's immediate family. So Thomas's brother, Fred, said that Thomas and his dad's personalities conflicted in a very big way. And Thomas would poke the bear, so to speak, as often as he could. Where Thomas's mother parented very differently. The book describes Peg as a listener. When her children came home from school, she wanted to hear about their day, wanted to hear about their stories. So she had a way of being encouraging in making her children feel good about their ideas. In school, Thomas wasn't present mentally. He was there, but now his mind was elsewhere. He instead drew. He drew cars, ships, movie stars, pinup girls, and he dreamed. And there's some of those drawings are in this book, which is really, really cool to see. Thomas attended the University of Detroit, a Jesuit high school, but he was kicked out after his freshman year for bad grades. Bernard was able to get Thomas into a Catholic central school, an all-boys parochial school. But after a month, Thomas failed a majority of his classes. At 17 years old, he submitted his enlistment form to the United States Navy. The thing is, he was underage, so he had to forge his father's signature. And it's funny because the book describes the Navy calling Thomas's parents because they're like, yeah, no, this signature looks pretty suspicious. So Tom said to his parents, quote, "I want to see the world. I need to see the world," end quote. And Bernard thought it over and reluctantly agreed. So Thomas went into the Navy. So in the fall of 1950, Tom reported to trading at the Naval Training Station in Great Lakes. He was assigned to Company 372. This chapter discusses all of the things that boot camp taught them. This included basic grooming standards, physical conditioning, how to swim, weapons, security, naval missions, etc. So there was a really, really cool quote in here that really stood out and I think just kind of set the ball rolling for the tone of the rest of the book. It says, but marksmanship and fighting weren't all he would learn. And over the next 4 years, Jay Sebring was born in the Navy. After graduation, Tom was assigned to his duty station in Guam, and that's where he started to cut his own hair. However, he had to keep it within Navy regulations. So Thomas, while doing that, was telling his Navy buddies what he was doing. And they started to ask him, would you cut my hair as well? So he would. And at this point, that's when he got the name, or nickname, I should say, TJ. So the book goes on to describe Tom being on board a 376-foot-long ship for months. And a few months after that, in October 1953, Tom started dating a girl in Seattle. And this was a very impactful relationship because it really started to blossom Tom's relationship at the time to so many well-known people. Because in this relationship, he became well connected to the music scene. Him and his girlfriend together went to shows, concerts, parties, clubs, dinners. And throughout this time, he got to meet so many musicians and performers. However, Tom also had a plan. He wanted to go to barber school to be a beautician. He had 3 months left in the Navy, however, before he could come home. So the book then goes on to the context of back home, which is Detroit. And it talks about Detroit before the Great Depression as well as after the Great Depression. And for myself, who was not around at that time or did not live in that area, I found this very helpful to give a great context to where he was from and the impact that this had on his community. So before the Great Depression was the Detroit that Tom would experience growing up as well into his early adulthood. Tom left Michigan and then went to Southern California. In the story about that, which is actually really funny because the way the authors describe it, like you can just visualize it, where he left in a beater car that had to be push started by some friends to even make it out of the driveway. But nonetheless, he made it. So now we get to LA, and the book talks a lot about LA history as well, which again, not just helpful for the context and timing of this time period, but also because there's a lot of relevance to Jay's story here. So, and this is something I did not know when I read this, that Jay was actually not the first man to cut hair in Los Angeles. A man named Peter Biggs was in 1852. The book describes a lot about Peter and that story, but I had no idea while reading that. So that was a really cool thing to learn. Again, there's a lot of history about LA in the chapter in this book for that. So the book talks about how then TJ, he did not arrive in Hollywood to reinvent himself. Instead, it was clear that he would bring his inventions to Hollywood directly. So Hollywood and this era. So the book kind of talks about, especially with men's hair, it was just so funny the way it describes it. There was a limited amount of pictures on a wall, and you would just kind of point to one. I think the book describes like 6 different hairstyles. You would point to one, and that's what they would do. There was no concept for quote unquote hairstyling at that time. So it was just very interesting to see how this is what was happening for so long. And TJ at this point was very intent on changing all of that. So as I go through the book in my review, as we see, I started out with Tom. Now we're at his nickname, TJ, and it will get to Jay. So I'm going to try to keep it straight in order of kind of how his nicknames progressed. But if I interchange one accidentally, just don't hold me to that. So if you're wondering why I went from Thomas to TJ, it's because at this point now, that is what his nickname is, and that is what he's going by, TJ. So in 1955, TJ arrived in the Golden State on a Greyhound bus with 2 sweatshirts, 1 pair of Levi's, and a pair of boots. He later had these boots bronzed when he became successful, kind of as a reminder of where he came from and how far he came. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, Danny, I thought he left in a car to get to LA. You are correct. You are correct. Along the way from Michigan to California, he ended up wrecking his car. So he had to then go by bus. So in regards to TJ arriving in Hollywood, he settled in East Hollywood because at that time it was affordable, it was centrally located, and it was about a 20-minute bus ride to the place where he would then learn his trade. In that place was the cosmetology school at Comer and Duran. This school, the book describes, was the Ivy League of cosmetology. The requirements of what the school had students do was mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. It talks about how the school required 1,600 hours. Yes, 1,600 hours of on-the-floor training, and it covered a lot of ground. This included, for example, treatments, styling for skin, hair, nails, sanitation practices, diseases, anatomy, and also anatomy and physiology. So TJ didn't just learn or take his craft, he would attack it in a way that had not been seen before or pretty much since. So the book, my next note here, there's comments throughout the book from the authors that it's so funny because the first time you read it, you're like, okay. And that was how TJ was great with women. It's brought up so much within the book that I kind of chuckled each time as it more and more came up. So I'm thinking, all right, we get it. Like, yeah, he could get any girl he wanted. And it was just kind of an interesting thing to kind of hear that. But when it first describes it and the quote that it uses, I was like, all right, y'all know I'm a cat person. So I'm like, I can't not take this quote and say it in my review. So it says, TJ was great with women. Quote, he was catnip to women, end quote. I was like, authors, I love that. I love that analogy. Love it. But yes, that is one of the things that it is talked about throughout the book, and it's sprinkled throughout is that he was great with women. So put that out there up front, but it's talked about quite a bit in the book. So Jay, now being in LA, in Hollywood, wrote a letter to his family. And that letter was in this book. And I will say there are so many letters that he writes to his family that are in this book. And it's just, on the one hand, really cool to be able to read that and kind of see what his mindset was at that time. But then also to take a step back and be like, how generous of his family to provide those, those letters, because it could so easily be summed up to say, oh, he wrote home just to say X, Y, and Z and to catch his family up on this. But to have it in there, it's just such to me, letter writing is such an intimate thing that it just really, as a reader, was like, wow, like this is something special that we're getting privy and an insight to be able to read. And I didn't take that for granted. And I hope readers don't take that for granted, because it's just so cool that that's something that his family kept and preserved, and now they're sharing it with us in this book. So that this is just one example of a letter that he did in his family that is in this book. So what he said to his family at the time of this letter was he was working nonstop, 6 days a week. And then on the 7th day, he would try to catch up on sleep. But for the most part, he would do some other things here and there, cut some other people's hair just to get enough money to carry through the next week. But in all of this, and you can see in the letter that he wrote, he never complained, because he knew that to get to where he needed to be, there was work that had to be done, and he was going to do that. So after he completed his 1,600 hours of study at Comer and Duran, the California State Board of Cosmetology certified his first license, and that was in the fall of 1956. So license number, and I love that his specific license number was in here in the book. License number H is in Harry, 3047. That is what enabled TJ to operate as a, quote, hairdresser and cosmetologist, end quote, for a full year. He then, after getting that, got a full-time job at the Shelley Hairstyle in South Central Los Angeles. The salon, however, was marketed exclusively to women, but that was okay. TJ took this information like a sponge. He was always learning, always, just a student of knowledge. And I just loved that, reading that. So even though we kind of know where he's going to go with his career, he still took this as a learning opportunity. This is where his new stylist name would come about and be announced. And that was Jay Coomer. So after a few months, Jay wasn't enjoying doing women's hair. He had visions, he had ideas about the type of hair and designs he wanted to do, and he wanted to be the one to implement them. He didn't want to work for another person. So he, at this time, and the book is just so raw and honest in his thoughts. So it says, Jay felt the conditions of most American men's hair was deplorable and felt flat. Most men's hair was burdened with grease and oil, and it was favoring unnatural styles that were either too short or too bristly. So Jay would design hairstyles and configure them to the individual person's face. In the book, Anthony would describe this a lot more in detail, because to take that sentence and, configure it to a person's face sounds like a simple enough concept, but there's so much behind it. Again, that is fully described in the book. Jay also, besides the type of cut, had strong ideas, including daily shampooing and conditioning. That was not something that was done back then. So what happened here is Bernard, so Jay's father, sent a final loan in the amount of $260.70 on March 3rd, 1959. That allowed Jay to place a $500 down payment to secure a very small space at 725 North Fairfax in West Hollywood. The rent at the time was $85 a month, which, again, I know we're in 2025, so we hear $85 a month and we're thinking, wait, what? But do the conversion. Do the conversion to back then. So $85 a month was quite substantial at that time. The day that he signed the lease, he wrote his father a letter. And part of it says, and it's just so heartwarming. It says, quote, I am in business for myself, no partners, and I am very happy. I am a very happy young man for the first time in a long time, end quote. Like, how impactful is that? That just really stood out to me. It's just such a proud moment of like, I'm getting there. I just took this huge step. I'm getting there. So Now the book moves on to, well, okay, he has the space, but there's a lot of work he has to do to make that space into his own, into something that he can then create and do as a business. He had to do everything himself with his own two hands. The book talks about how he carried lumber on his shoulder from a nearby hardware store because, again, he didn't have a car. A group of friends had promised to help him out, but they didn't show up. Jay would work all day and all night for 3 weeks to open the salon. He would only stop to eat and sleep, and he slept there with only a sleeping bag and a pillow. Ultimately, the salon opened on March 24th, 1959. So there is a note here that I have. So, and this is just a slight critique just for me. Y'all know I like things done very chronologically. That's just kind of how I like to read as the story unfolds. At this point in the book, and I didn't really see it anywhere else in the book, so I was wondering, did I just misread this part, or was this part intentionally done that way, where some of the paragraphs in this section talk about the work leading up to opening the salon, and then it talks about the salon being open. And then as you're reading about it, several paragraphs in, then it jumps back again to before the salon was open. And again, the amount of work Jay had to put in at that time. So I just found that section particularly interesting because it just kind of jumped back and forth quite a bit. And I didn't see why structurally that part happened because it didn't do that anywhere else in the book. But that is really just one of the very, very few critiques that I have in here. But it, again, just that section. So Jay then went to a party and met Barbara Luna. She was a singer and actress, and the two started dating. So she wanted to help Jay. So what she did was she would not just help, but like physically get in there and do the work, sweeping floors at the salon, preparing the shop for its opening. And this is where they had conversations about him changing his last name. And she was super supportive of this. And the book talks about where that last name kind of came from. And it was soon after that Jay flipped open a men's magazine and came across sketches of a Sebring racetrack in Florida. Jay liked the sound of Sebring, and as a business and professional last name, thought of using it. So shortly before his salon opened, he made the change. So now Jay Sebring. The book talks about how his parents were not fully supportive of that idea for a name change. But to be perfectly honest, that wouldn't be surprising of a lot of parents kind of saying that to somebody who wants to change their name. Because again, he went from Thomas to TJ to Jay, and then changing his last name as well. So it was a full change. So I was, who wouldn't be surprised reading this where you're like, okay, well, yeah, why wouldn't his parents kind of be like, wait, what are you doing? So now the salon is open. And at first it was not easy at all for Jay. The book talks about how sometimes he would stand cutting hair for 12 to 13 hours a day on his feet without a break. Some days there would only be 1 or 2 customers in the store all day. And then some days on the flip side, there'd be no customers at all. And he found it very hard to make ends meet. And what Jay was also fighting at this time was men didn't understand the concept of what they already knew about a haircut. And for those who would think about it, they didn't want to necessarily deviate from what was just normal at that time, right? So Jay's cuts were $5. This at the time was double what barbers were getting. So Jay, what he would do was cut his friend's hair, hoping that they could make referrals. The book talks about how there were times he was so desperate, he would get strangers off the street to come in, offer them a free cut, and hoping that next time they needed a haircut, they would come back to him. So there was also not just kind of the internal making his salon work from a financial standpoint that he was battling, but also externally. The book talks about how there was a group of teens from high school that would gather daily outside of his shop and give customers that were entering and exiting just a really hard time about their new haircuts, kind of questioning their masculinity, which my note was just like, what the hell? Like, kids, what the hell? But nonetheless, so Jay had sent a letter to his family, and this time he was requesting $1,000 to keep the business open. And after some debating, his parents agreed to loan him the money. Jay's girlfriend, Barbara, connected him to his first celebrity client, Vic Damon. And I might be mispronouncing that last name. So Vic talks about how he never had a haircut before, like he had when Jay cut his hair. He appreciated Jay's artistry, and he would ultimately bring him clients whenever he could. So Jack Entrutter, the director of entertainment at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, he noticed Vic's haircut, and he had to get one as well, one of Jay's haircuts. So from 1960 to 1967, he regularly flew to Las Vegas, so Jay did, to cut Jack's hair. Now this is when kind of word began spreading, and others began asking for, quote, the flying barbers, end quote, services. This included a lot of well-known names, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, Joey Bishop, etc. So now that we're going into Las Vegas, the book takes the time to discuss the history of the Las Vegas Strip, and particularly the history before all these people migrated there. Once that is kind of given to the reader, so they have a full understanding of Las Vegas at that time, now we get to the Strip being constructed and ultimately growing. There were major players at the time, including mobsters and celebrities that came and would make Vegas, such a big attraction. For Jay, Vegas, however, it was not a playground. It was completely business. He was there to do a job. So it seems like now almost overnight, Jay made it. But of course, as you have gone through reading the book so far, you're like, no, this was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get to where he was. And yeah, he was now taking off. His business was taking off. He was now flying on private jets, living in luxury, being embraced by his celebrity clients. But things weren't just all kind of glitz and glamour at this time. There was so much that was going on in Vegas, in the US at this time. And the book describes that as well. And that is a lot of racism was happening. And the authors talk about how Jay had a wide variety of clientele and friends, all races, all genders, all religion. So and we'll touch more upon that point a little later in the book. So kind of put a pin in that point. But again, there was a lot kind of going on socially and culturally that kind of impacted or had a way of framing kind of what would happen, not only at this time with Jay's business, but as the book and his career unfolds. So we'll get to that later. So again, now Jay, with, again, his celebrity clientele, his haircuts became kind of a symbol of a status. Like, you were somebody, if you got one of his cuts. So Jay now needed to expand, and he would hire new cutters at the salon. And one of them was Joe Tornava. So little Joe, if you guys missed, oh gosh, what was it now? A few months ago, Paul had interviewed Joe over on the Paulcast. Check that out, because not only does Joe get into his career in history as somebody who worked, at the salon with Jay, but kind of after, kind of where his career went, where Joe's went because of Jay. So definitely check that out if you missed that. Again, that's over on the Paulcast. But yes, so Joe was now one of the cutters at the salon. And soon he would be accompanying Jay to Las Vegas for his celebrity clients to assist with that. So now, again, with Jay's business kind of booming, he had to hire new cutters at the salon. There was now a line of people waiting to get in to get a haircut from Jay. So he employed 8 full-time staff. So kind of, again, think of back to at the beginning of the book where it was 2 to 3 clients a day. If that, some days there were nobody coming in to get a cut. And now there was a line and people were waiting because they had to get their hair cut by Jay. So next in the book, okay, my note. So this is chapter 10, and that is called Demand and Supply. And the reason I'm kind of saying this chapter by number and by name, I have a note here that it was one of my favorite chapters in the entire book, because here it really describes how things changed for Jay and what that meant from his side and the Hollywood side. So again, I'm just giving little pieces here, but this was by far one of my favorite chapters of the book. And it talks about before Jay come along, again, men had limited options. Right, we talked about that earlier. Jay was out now to cut down those barriers, quote, and to encourage men to express their attractiveness and individuality, end quote. So Jay was not only transforming people's looks, but he was transforming their careers as well. And he was in part responsible for the looks that we remember when we see them in pictures. And I think what comes to a lot of people's minds, at least I'll speak for myself, is Jim Morrison. We've all seen that photo. That's a Jay Sebring cut in style. And again, that is just such a symbolic and timeless look. And Jay's responsible for that. So again, there's a lot that we can kind of think back and look and go, oh my gosh, that was his work. And it still stands the test of time, which is just amazing, amazing. So some of the well-known celebrities, I know we've kind of touched upon some of their names, but a lot of them have expanded at this point. So now there's a lot more involved. Again, this list is just some. Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Henry Fonda, Michael Douglas, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, George Pepper, Dennis Hopper, and Warren Beatty. So for his celebrity clientele, Jay offered privacy and exclusivity. There was a VIP door at the back of his building, so his celebrity clients could slip in quietly to Jay's private chair without waiting like everybody else. So think about what type of a perk that was for his celebrity clientele. Dominic Dunn said, quote, if you got into Jay's private room to have your hair cut, you made it, end quote. What a powerful statement and what a powerful quote that was. It's just so spot on to where Jay is right now in his career, right? So business booming, he expanded his shop again. And an expansion would let him have cutting stations for these 8 employees. And he carefully selected his employees. They all had keys to the salon. And he would say to them, quote, you don't work for me, we work together, end quote. And that just, again, shows the reader what type of not only salon owner that he was, but what type of person that he was, right? He wasn't there to micromanage. He wasn't there to kind of be above everybody else. He's like, no, we work together. And that's just such an incredible way of managing, in a way that I wish more people were like that. But nonetheless, I just thought that was a really great way to describe him, because you're like, okay, we're getting to know through the book so many different avenues of his life and kind of where his mindset was when everything. So when you get to this and kind of oversees his staff and what his thought is, you're like, wow, it just carries through everything. Everything just really lines up, at least for myself as the reader, with kind of his personality. It's just straight through everything, which is just very authentic. So there were 2 shifts now for his salon, an 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then a 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. And some clients get this, would wait almost 3 months to get an appointment. Imagine that. Like, you read that, and my mind as a reader, I'm like, oh my gosh, he went from some days no people in his salon to maybe 2 or 3 to now people had to wait almost 3 months to get an appointment. Like, that's incredible. Like, incredible. So Jay, he also changed the way that he charged his clients, right? So we talked a little bit earlier about, and this was a bit further back, where he would charge $5 for a haircut. And that was still a lot more than the barbers were getting at that time. So now he had an initial consultation, and that charge was $15. The consultation was to observe the man's bone structure, face, skull, learn the occupation that they had, and what type of lifestyle that this man led. In the book gives the example, was a kind of more casual business. And then the cut cost $100. Okay, at that time. So $15 consultation, $100 cut. Jay's enterprise, and it was still expanding. So he decided to start to experiment with shampoos and conditioners. And he hired chemists to create the best organic pH balanced hair care and product line. A few years later, he would develop his own shampoo and product line. He would also update the shop's exterior. And this exterior view made an impact now of how people saw the shop. Because again, think of the beginning of him building it to now what it looked like. It's just complete night and day, because again, of all the success that he's now had in his career, it makes sense now that things were going to be revamping a bit for the better, right? So Jay was now approaching 30 years old and looking to settle down with someone. And his career was now in a very solid place. And I have a note here. This is, again, another note that is, it says, Jay had no shortage of women before. So again, another theme that's just throughout, it's just sprinkled in here where, yeah, he was great with women. He had no trouble getting women, so on and so forth. And this was one of those moments. So Cameo Sebring, she was Bonnie Lee Marple, met Jay when she came into his shop at 17 years old with her boyfriend, actor. The two married in Vegas 2 weeks later. The house that they shared had celebrity friends that would come and go all of the time. So Jay had now purchased 723 North Fairfax Avenue, opening another shop location, because demand for Jay was now including him providing his services at movie studios, on locations, planes overseas. So again, his career is skyrocketing, and in his personal life, he was now married. But things would not be smooth sailing. In 1962, the barbers were becoming frustrated with Jay. The barbers union was harassing them and harassing him. They were initiating visits from the barbers board for various code infractions. When the board inspections and infractions were not enough to close down the shop, they would then resort to verbal and physical threats. So Jay, not being one to sit back and take it, he just fought right back. And he would call on friends like Charlie Barron, Jack and Trotter, as well as some underworld types from Detroit. And this included the Purple Gang. And we do learn more in the book about who the Purple Gang was. So the Barbers Union legally attacked Jay's salon. They were asserting that only barbers were licensed to cut men's hair and cosmetologists were only licensed to cut women's hair. Jay's response was, quote, hair knows no gender, end quote. So at this point, it's when Jay and Little Joe, finally introduced and passed new legislation that permanently established the right of cosmetologists to perform services on men and the right of barbers to cut women's hair. So even on the sets of movies, studios, filming locations, the hair and makeup union, they were also angry with Jay. So what Jay would do was eventually have to sadly be escorted off these studio lots, and he was banned from future entry. Again, not from any, he was just doing what he had to do, for his career. But again, there was just so many fighting against what he was doing. So in response, again, he's being escorted off these studio lots. That didn't stop it. That did not stop it. Entertainers began then going to Jay's house or vice versa before filming. This would result with Hollywood where it hurts, right? Production delays in Hollywood's most powerful. They now knew it was fine. They were going to get what they wanted, and they wanted Jay to do their hair. Didn't matter if it impacted the filming, production delays, it was going to happen. And that says so much, I think, about his work and his clientele, especially being like, doesn't matter. If the studio has to wait, I'm going to get who I need to do my hair. I think that was just amazing, like absolutely amazing. So Jay, again, working huge, long hours, 12-hour days, traveling to places like Las Vegas, New York to cut people's hair. This resulted in him barely being home, which again, he was recently married, and he not only didn't have time to see and spend time with his wife, Cammy, but wasn't able to just enjoy the things that he worked so hard for. So not able to drive his cars and, again, just enjoy his home that he bought. So the barbers union, right? Because there's been this back and forth that was really, really volatile. So they and Jay finally reached a deal at the end of 1961. And that was the entire north side of the Fairfax salon would be solely to act by barbers, but only after being trained and certified in the Sebring method of cutting. The south side of the shop was exclusively run by hair cosmetologists and hair designers. So this agreement in the end actually doubled Jay's revenue. And after this battle was done, Jay now completely focused on a hair care product line carrying the Sebring name. He knew that this would be another way to break into the industry where it really hadn't been done before in the way that he wanted. So, this next part, my note here. My note is literally like, this was so sad because as the reader, you're reading this and you're like, he has everything. I mean, not in Jay's mind, there's still more. There's still more to do, and there's still more ground to go through. But at this point, again, as the reader, you're like, wow, he has this, that's amazing. But this part of the book, it talks about how he went home to share this good news with his wife, Cammy. But when he arrived home, Cammy was gone, as well as all of her belongings. They had been living separate lives, and this had been taking a toll on her. And it's just like, oh my gosh. Like, it was just such a heartbreaking thing to read. But in the end, Jay would not be down on his luck for very long. In comes Steve McQueen. So Jay met Steve in late spring 1962. Jay gave Steve a haircut that defined the way Steve McQueen defined cool. And I loved that sentence in the book. Like, loved that. It was just, loved it. So Jay was one of the few people that Steve McQueen actually wanted in his life. And the book was a bit more about Steve in the book to kind of get that idea of why that would be that way. So we also now in the book learn about Bruce Lee. So Jay was cutting the hair of a television producer who had told him, we were looking for an Asian actor who could fight, was good looking, and would be able to play a lead role. And Jay instantly thought of Bruce Lee. And this really opened the door for Bruce Lee for his entire career. Because at this time, it was routine for studios to hire white men to play Asian parts. But thanks to Jay, Bruce Lee was now able to completely change that. So LA in Hollywood, right? So LA was completely changing at this time. And the book talks about how the LA Strip changed. There were now new places being opened, and one of those was the Whiskey A Go Go. So celebrities there would have their own booths. Steve McQueen would go and have his own booth, but also that Jay Sebring, he now had his own booth at these places. Which what a status symbol of like where he got to in his career, that he was now one of them, which is just so cool because again, so much hard work went into that. And now he was able to kind of enjoy the fruits of his labor, right? So next we see, so the book talks about Sharon Tate. So Sharon Tate, as well as her family, we get quite a bit of a background on them, and her family moving to the Rancho Palos Verdes area. And not only do we learn about her and her family, but her start into the acting industry. So the book talks about Sharon and Jay meeting, and the lunch was arranged by Hollywood publicist Joe, and I'm probably going to butcher the last name, Joe Himes. A few weeks later, Joe went to Jay's, and when he was there, Sharon was at the top of the steps in a negligee. So needless to say, Jay and Sharon then started to spend a lot of time together, and they became engaged. So now, again, Jay still has his flourishing career and now has a new girl, and that is Sharon. So the product line that he was working on, the Sebring International Complete product line, was now introduced in 1966. Jay also opened up 2 more spaces, one in Palm Springs, California, and the other in Las Vegas, Nevada. So expanding the brand also meant sharing his haircut techniques with other people. So Jay developed a school, and barbers from across the country would travel to West Hollywood to study and learn the Sebring method. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. One name I pronounced correctly. Thank you. So how cool is that, right? That all of these barbers would fly from across, like wild. So barbers, cutters, and stylists, again, across the country, what they could also do was pay a large fee to become what was known as, quote, Sebring certified, end quote. What this would entail was going to Los Angeles and learning the methods and technique directly from Jay. They could then also sell Jay's product line in their stores once they pass the course. So again, that was just another way for him to expand what he was doing and to have a little piece here and a little piece there, which was just so cool, like so creative for him to just not only do this style himself, but then to teach it to so many others who were, again, flying in from everywhere to be able to learn that and become certified in that, which is just absolutely incredible. So Jay was now having opportunities emerge outside of the salon business. He was now making appearances on TV shows, writing articles in popular magazines, making a cameo in a future film, and making guest appearances on late night talk shows. So now we go to December 16th, 1965, and Jay arrives in London. He would go back and forth to Europe 7 times before the end of this year, both for business opportunities as well as to accompany his girlfriend, or fiance, I should say, Sharon Tate. Back at the salon, however, Jay learned that several of his employees had actually walked out in the middle of the night, 5 to 6 of them specifically. And in this book, it has a quote from Joe about how much that really hurt Jay. So Joe did not do that. He was one of the few that did not walk out. And again, it's just such an emotional thing, because you really learn how much Jay trusted and invested in everybody. Again, let's go back to earlier. when Jay said to his staff, like, you don't work for me, we work together. So to have that type of style as a business owner, and then to have 5 to 6 of his employees walk out in the middle of the night, it's just another level of hurt that would have touched him, right? So that was one thing that he had to now kind of, all right, get those salon cutters back in there, because that is huge. That's a huge number of people to walk out. So, but again, with his professional life kind of taking that dip, going back to his personal life. So Sharon, her career was taking off. So now she was in London. And this is where she meets Roman Polanski. So Sharon would eventually start seeing Roman and moved in with him. The thing is, Jay was more than 5,000 miles away. The book talks about how they would stay friends, but at one point, Sharon wanted Jay to come to Europe to kind of give her his approval of Roman. So he did. On February 12th, 1966, Jay arrived in London and met Roman. Needless to say, they all became good friends. Jay was upset about the breakup with Sharon, and it did take him a while before he went back to dating women. According to the book, it was even hard for him to be intimate with others for a while during that phase, that he was kind of grieving the loss of that relationship with Sharon. So one of the things, the notes I have here is, and it was just for me kind of like a question, and the book doesn't answer it, but it doesn't, I didn't feel it was omitted. I'm thinking, was there an answer anyway? Because one of the things that the book kind of goes into with Sharon and Jay's relationship was, he said Sharon was so much younger than Jay that he wasn't necessarily ready to kind of settle down and be married. But then I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, but he proposed to her. So it was just kind of a, well, why propose if you're not ready to get married? And I know that's what the $1 million question, right? But, and it's not unique to this situation, but I was just kind of like, they could have just stayed boyfriend and girlfriend versus getting engaged, because then of course, once you're engaged, the next step is wanting to actually make that official and get married. So I just was kind of wondering why, but again, that was just me being nosy, wondering about that. So, but that was that. In regards to Sharon and Roman, they again were together, but then actually married on January 20th, 1968. So let's see. At this time, it was very big, not just for, Jay and Sharon kind of separating relationship-wise, her getting married, but also culturally. We saw big cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Berkeley. They were, quote, the hubs for the most pivotal activity, end quote. Hippies were now pushing the conventional parameters of the time. At this point in the book, the author brought up a 32-year-old ex-con who made a name for himself in the hippie underworld. We all would know that man would be Charles Manson. So the book talks about how he worked his way to the Haight-Ashbury area and connected with Lynette Fromme, Mary Brunner, Patricia Kremwinkle, etc. So I will say I do have some comments on the kind of sections with Manson and, the different family members as the story unfolds here in the book. So kind of put a pin in that, because I will have a comment on that later. Just one that kind of stuck with me as a reader. So Jay, he did not adapt to the kind of hippie lifestyle. But one of the things that he did do was kind of physically, he did grow his hair a little bit longer. His clothing was now a bit more casual than it had been. But also his attitude towards sex was a bit more laid back than it had been even before. So there were some aspects that he did adapt to, but not like the full hippie life that a lot of people were kind of taking to at that time. So again, 1968, big time of regards to what was going on in the world at the time. Talks about Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK being assassinated, the Black Panthers in Oakland, the DNC event in Chicago, and the college protesters against the Vietnam War. So again, the book goes a lot more into those different time periods. I'm just kind of summing them up here. So Jay had connections not just with celebrity clientele, but also politicians in office. And this was discussed in the book, especially his relationship with Thomas M. Reese, who was a Democrat. Robert Kennedy was also connected with Jay, and there is a letter in the book from Robert Kennedy to Jay because Jay had attended an event for him. So the opportunity came for Jay to partner on a salon in San Francisco. And that was with Ray McWade and Art Bloom. So Art was the one that contacted Jay to make the offer, and it was an offer that Jay just could not pass up. So Jay put the touches on this new place, his name above the front door, and added a photo of himself and some of his celebrity clients on the walls. Not much more was needed than that. It was, again, a very easy transition for that. The San Francisco salon opened on May 24th, 1969. Invitations for the opening were sent to an exclusive group of influential people and celebrities. And at the salon, some of the cutters were female. They had to earn the respect from Jay, but in the end, they do still have fond memories of him. And there was one cutter in particular that talked a little bit about that in this book, and that was kind of really cool to hear her perspective of Jay because she was working in that field as well. So after the shop finally opened, Jay was there almost every day for 3 months. He would he would stay in San Francisco Monday to Friday on his houseboat, and then he would fly back to Los Angeles on the weekends. So the feud with the Barbers Union, it had erupted by 1967. So we're just going back in time a little bit. So just the previous year. So there was a new law prohibiting cosmetologists from cutting men's hair, and that was challenged by a hairstylist and owner of shops in Glendale and in Hollywood. This guy challenged the law by suing the State Board of Cosmetology and the State Board of Barbers Examiners. Little Joe, was the one that brought this to Jay's attention. Jay felt that forming a guild and getting other hairstylists, designers, and even barbers to join would protect them and their common interests. So Jay was president and Joe was vice president. Joe had told one of his clients who had political ties about this and what was happening. And this led to Kenneth Corey, Democrat assemblyman of the 69th district in Orange County, agreeing to sponsor a bill that would allow barbers to cut women's hair and for cosmetologists to cut men's hair and to work in the same space. So this bill basically said if you're a hairdresser or cosmetologist and you've been cutting hair for a number of years, you're allowed to take the barber's test. You didn't have to go to barber school, but you had to take the test and you had to pass the test. So the first day to take the test was August 11th, 1969. And this part in the book, my notes here was just like, this was such a sad, sad thing to read. So Joe recalls in the book his emotions when he passed the exam. And he talks about how he took the exam 2 days after Jay was murdered. So August 9th. So we're kind of going forward a little bit, but it just gives context to the work that they were doing for this guild. So what Joe says was, quote, "I was seriously grieving for Jay, but I had to do this for him because we worked so hard to get this through. I had to do it. I just had to. This laid the groundwork for everyone to work together now. Before they couldn't. I now have both licenses, but I only went to school for one," end quote. So again, Joe and Jay were now responsible for California salons going unisex and introducing legislation that granted the rights of cosmetologists to cut in-style men's hair and barbers to cut women's hair. So this was a big, big deal. this was revolutionary. And the book would say, and it's spot on, it had permanent global implications. It's so easy for us to kind of think now, like, it's just no big deal because this is something we're used to. But back then, this was huge, like huge. And they achieved that, which is just inspiring and beyond incredible, like beyond. So to kind of keep going on now. So the book, twists now to the end of the 60s. And it was becoming home to hundreds of false prophets, gurus, cult leaders. The book lists several of them and goes into detail about them, which I actually enjoyed reading this part. It talks about, the children of God, Heaven's Gate, Source family. So for anybody who's kind of aware of that time frame, or even if you're not, this is just an interesting read to kind of show, again, what was happening at the end of the 60s. But also the book then goes on to describe the Manson family. So I won't go a lot into depth in that because I would just rather prefer focusing on Jay and his story. I will say my note for that, I did see that kind of as when it comes down to when the murders do happen, I can see why it was as detailed as it was from the author's perspective of getting the bullshit narrative out and what really happened in there. In regards to kind of talking about introducing, Charles Manson and all of the people relative to that group, I was surprised that the authors went, I think, as in depth as they did. I really wasn't expecting that. I was expecting maybe a touch of that because it's pertinent to this, but then moving back onto Jay. So I was actually really surprised the way they took so much time to talk about that in this book. And I will say it wasn't only that, but it was even the tone of it was just so, I don't know if neutral is the right word, but the tone doesn't break from the rest of the book. And I felt as a reader, like if the tone was going to change, this was going to be it. Talking about Manson and all of those involved with this and with the murder of Jay, that would have been the time to kind of, for the tone to change. And it wouldn't have been unexpected, but it didn't happen that way. And it was such an artistic choice that I felt, wow, like I don't know if I could have done that. From their perspective, I just was shocked and in awe that they were able, again, to keep the tone as it was. That was just one of the things that stood out to me. I was like, wow, I would, that was, yeah. You know what I mean? It was just very interesting, but let's rewind a little bit. So again, I won't get a ton into this here, but the book does expand more on Charles Manson and kind of his group at this time. So then going forward and back to Jay. So the book talks about his schedule. And I know there are several times where we've been like, he's nonstop busy. Well, yeah, he's still nonstop busy. And this is when he would produce a training film, and it was called Hair Power. It was a 106-minute film. It would cover many of his tips, techniques, implementations, and it featured his product line. And he would also perform different style haircuts in this video. This was another way to, again, get the Jay Sebring method out there to as many cutters as possible. And this film also included some of Jay's powerful and introspective quotes. A lot of these quotes are in the book. There are 3 of them in particular. And my note for that was truly from the heart, inspirational, because it was, on the one hand, you're thinking, okay, well, he's making a video about his work and about his salon and what he does. But it's not just work to him. And you really sense that when you read his quotes for this. You're just like, it's just so much more impactful, and it that was not lost on me in this. So the book also states from Anthony that only 2 or 3 copies of the original film exist. So there have been small clips that have kind of popped up online, but Anthony states in the book that he does not know how those clips got into the kind of public online forum, but it was not from his family. So film rolls also from Jay's camera. So we're going to jump forward a little bit. They were taken by the LAPD, and those images were leaked as well. And we've all seen those photos. Those are the ones of Jay and Sharon just before they were murdered. It's images lounging by the pool. They show a closeness and a bond that had still remained with Jay and Sharon. So the book talks about Roman Polanski, going back to him, and now it goes more in depth of him as a person, his past kind of in his career, as well as his family. Again, because we all know his family had been taken to the Holocaust, and the book was very also open about once Roman, grew up, that he was with several women outside of Sharon. And this included underage girls. And I feel like a lot of this information about Roman isn't surprising if you're familiar with this case. So the Tates. So Sharon's family, they were aware that he was probably with other women besides their daughter. They were not okay with that. They were not. So there are a lot of people that are in this book that talk about Sharon and Jay's relationship, and then Sharon and Roman's relationship. And it's very interesting, because what a lot of people in regards to Sharon and Jay say is that the love between them never fully went away. So Kirk Douglas, he wrote in his book that Jay went with Sharon before Roman did. And there, it says in here that the baby might have been Jay's. Again, who knows? But it was very interesting that that was kind of put into this book, because you're just, oh, okay. Because that had been, rumors had been floating online for a while. The book also talks about Michelle Phillips, and it talks about how she slept with Roman Polanski. And this was one where Sharon did not overlook this. Where Sharon might have overlooked a lot, Michelle was different, because Michelle was her friend. So very, very different. It was kind of too close to home type of thing. So the book talks about how Sharon saw legal options through Alvin Greenwald, who was one of Jay's attorney. So this is where it says, we did see attorney Greenwald interviewed during the 2020 documentary Jay Sebring Cutting to the Truth. So before I get a little bit further into that, there is, for those who have seen it, and I meant to say this earlier and totally forgot, there is the documentary Cutting to the Truth. So I'm not anything that I'm talking about in here is not about anything to do with the documentary. I have seen that. I remember getting it or renting it, I should say, as soon as it came out. But for tonight's purposes, I'm talking strictly about the book. But if you've seen the documentary, then some of this you might be like, oh, right, I remember that. That was talked about or touched upon in the documentary. But it's very interesting because, I have so many notes tonight in regards to what we're going over tonight, but the documentary, you can only fit so much into a documentary, right? So that's where the book, you're able to, from the author's perspective, get so much more information out there to the reader. But nonetheless, we did see Attorney Greenwald in that documentary. So some of the quotes from that documentary are in this book, regarding specifically about drawing up the papers for a divorce for Sharon regarding Roman Polanski. She was going to tell Roman when he got back from London. So next, Tom O'Neill and chaos. So Anthony references in this book that in the early 2000s, Tom O'Neill reached out to Jay's sister at her work, claiming to be working on a piece that was focused more on victims' perspective. So Anthony's mother, Peggy, did agree to meet with Tom, and Anthony attended as well. However, when Chaos was published, there was no information in that book from that interview. Put a pin in that because that will come up later in the book as well. But for anybody that's read Chaos, you're going to think, yeah, there was nothing in there. But no, Peggy and Anthony did meet with Tom. But again, we'll get back to that. So we learned that when Sharon came back from Europe, her and Jay spent a lot of time together, right? And we just kind of talked about the possibility of the divorce papers for when Roman came back from Europe as well. He was still really busy with his career overseas. And then Jay being here with Sharon, he was still really busy in his career as well. Sharon was eagerly also getting ready for the birth of her baby because, again, she was pregnant. So the Los Angeles police discover that Jay and Sharon saw each other at least 4 times in the week leading up to August 8th, 1969. And one of the quotes here was that, quote, many believe the two had rekindled their romance, end quote. So in regards to the note of like the police discovering that Jay and Sharon saw each other at least 4 times in the week, like I guess as a reader, I was thinking, okay, well, if they're still really close and they're still friends, I don't see anything wrong with that. But again, with all of the kind of questioning of, well, were they still together and whatnot, and the rumor could the baby have been his, because that is touched upon in the book as well, might put a different light on it. But I think initially reading it, I was just like, okay, well, they're still close friends, so I don't really see the big deal, but that's just me. So at this point in the book, the authors transition. And my note here for this was actually, I felt it was a very abrupt transition. It wasn't as kind of smooth as every other chapter had been. And it was when the authors now transition to after the murders. So the authors state that there are only 2 people alive on the planet today that know exactly what happened that night at 10050 Cielo Drive. And that's Patricia Krenwinkel and Charles Tex Watson. So with that being said, it transitions to that. It's now going to jump back to what happened that night of the murders from the beginning to the end. There's a lot of information that is discussed here. Again, I'm just going to briefly touch upon it, but there's so much more, very specific in this book as well. So just keep that in mind as a reader. You get a lot of insight into this part of the narrative. So the book references that Jay might have initially thought that the guests coming, it would have been some kind of joke, some type of hoax. But once Tex Watson had the gun, then it was very clear that no, this isn't a joke. Something very bad is happening right now. So Tony DiMaria, Jay's brother-in-law, stated what he thought might have happened that night in his opinion. So again, Tony, Jay's brother-in-law, says, quote, there were practical jokes that went on at different times, and it's my thinking that Jay thought that this was a practical joke at first. I don't think he was taking this seriously. He was going along with it until they got in the room when they were all together, and he realized what was starting to happen. Then it was too late, end quote. There are a lot of accounts of what happened in regards to the order of what happened in that house. So the authors make sure to say that there are several irrefutable accounts in court testimony of Jay's last actions, and specifically noting that all of that is absent from Vincent Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter. I could go on a total rant about Helter Skelter, but that's a story for another day. But again, nothing in there about Jay's actions. but it's in here. It is in here. So once Jay realized that the situation was not a prank or a robbery, it was an attack, and he became defiant. So after Tex Watson grabbed Sharon's arm and jerked her toward him, Jay charged at Tex while attempting to throw a blow with a clenched fist when he saw an opening. Jay, it talks about how he advanced and lunged towards Tex, which Tex turned it back to Jay. So at this point in the book, Deborah Tate says, learning from her father's investigation about what happened in the house that night, she says, quote, once they realized the events were not some kind of hoax, Jay started fighting with everything he had, end quote. So I mention each of those because there's a lot of similar, can't be happening. This has to be a joke, right? Which, again, living in 2025, our mind might not go to that. But back then, this type of thing did not happen the way this happened, right? So it's not out of the realm of possibilities that there'd be like, wait, is this a joke? Is this really happening? And then once that realization hit, again, it was too late. But Jay, nonetheless, he was fighting back. He was defiant. He fought with everything he had. So the author also puts original trial testimony in the book from 1971. This is when Tex Watson confirms that Jay seized a moment to physically attack him. However, this is also when Susan Atkins alerted Tex to Jay. So the author puts a footnote in the book that in Tex's October 15th, 2021 parole hearing, he confirmed again that Jay caught him off guard, saying, quote, I got scared and I shot him. And then he went to the ground and he was still moving. I went over and stabbed him, end quote. Again, this is my note here is one of these examples where I'm like, to me, this shouldn't have been a footnote. This should have been in with the rest of the books. I thought it was so important to what was being discussed. So again, I mentioned this earlier. This is one of those examples. Do not skip over the footnotes. There's so much in there. Like, you will do yourself a disservice if you do not read the footnotes in this book. All of them. So let's see. The author also puts trial testimony from Susan Atkins that Jay did fight back as well. The author references forensic specialist Dr. Michael Bodden, and I have a note here. Dr. Michael Bodden, and I was very, very fortunate and honored to have met him in 2024 at CrimeCon. Dr. Michael, I'm just the biggest fan of Dr. Bodden's work. I own several of his books. I've done several reviews of those. But to me, when the name Dr. Michael Bodden is brought in, I'm listening. Full attention. And he's one of those forensic specialists that I'm like, all right, he's been doing this for so long and has such experience and wisdom that I'm like, what he says, I'm going to put money down on that. So that's just that. What I think of him. So Dr. Michael Bodden says, in regards to the bullet that struck Jay, it would have impaired him by internal bleeding, so he could have struggled for a bit. So what he's referring to is the bullet would have caused a lot of internal bleeding, and it would not have left Jay incapacitated immediately, just to put it a bit more simply. So again, I'm just giving like the littlest details here, but the book goes so much more deeper into it. At this point, the book talks about Tex putting the rope around Jay's neck. He struggled to get to his feet, grasping to breathe. Tex again attacked Jay repeatedly, kicking him in the face with a steel-toed boot. With Jay still fighting back, this led an opportunity for Wojtek to free himself and run towards the front door. But Susan alerted Tex that Wojtek was escaping, so Tex went to stop Wojtek. This gave Abigail Folger the opportunity to run out of the back of the house. However, Patricia chased her with a knife and caught up to her and attacked her. The book also details the last moment of Sharon and her unborn baby. I won't get a lot into that, but it does go into detail about that. We hear about or read about Susan using the blood-soaked towel to write the word pig on the front door. And then it just says that she tossed the towel inside the house where it landed on Jay's head. And that had something I had read before that statement. But my note here, again, I think just kind of as I'm carrying, from the reader perspective, Jay's story here and going through it, and then to get to this point where she just kind of just tosses the towel inside and it lands on his head. It just really, it was just cringe, and it made me so angry and disgusted because I'm just like, you're just throwing it on him like it's just trash, not like it's nothing. And it just, again, to have read as far as we did as the reader, and you get this connection, and then it just really, really bothered me at that point where I was as the reader with the book. But that's my note on that. Just, it didn't sit well. It didn't sit well. So the coroner's report, that is discussed in the book as well. And it later provided a tally of the wounds that the victims had suffered. So 7 gunshots, dozens of lethal blows to the face and head, and 103 stabbings. At this point, the author really makes it clear to the reader about Jay's final actions to defend himself and his friends. And you got that already as you read it. You saw these, Jay fighting, that led Wojtek to have the opportunity to try to escape. Jay still fighting. Now that gave Abigail the opportunity to try to escape. There was just so many things that Jay did in those final moments to try to help and save him and his friends, that by the time you get to that point where the author is saying, all right, you just read it, but let's just lay it out there so it's clear. And they just really put the message just simply to the reader and take it home with, he did not just sit there and let this happen. And this is not just opinion based. These actions are confirmed by court testimonial in forensics, but they've not been covered in detail in decades since this murder occurred, right? But it's in here. So one of the things that is talked about kind of now throughout the book is that Jay fighting back caused a lot of chaos in the crime scene because the murders didn't go as planned. It was supposed to be a much smoother process. Jay was not going to sit back and take it. So all hell broke loose. And that's again, it's going to come up at different times throughout the rest of the book, but the killers did not plan for that. They did not plan for the chaos. They did not plan for Jay to fight back with everything he had for as long as he had. But because of that fighting, it inadvertently left behind crucial physical blood evidence that was later used in court to help convict them. So now that we've kind of got that part of the crime scene and what happened, putting that aside, the book shifts. And my note right here is this was the most emotional part in the book for me to read. And it was, for most of his life, Anthony DiMaria, wanted to know the truth about what happened to his uncle during those final moments of his life. So on March 29th, 2024, Anthony wrote to Tex trying to get answers. In the book lists the questions that he had asked Tex. Tex responded in an email on April 9th, 2024, and he answered those questions. Again, you can get all the info in the book. Tex also answered questions regarding rumors and ulterior motives about the Manson family and the victims that night at Cielo Drive. But again, for me, reading that, I can't, it just, the way it's laid out, it was just really, really emotional for just to see Anthony take that like put that out there to text to get these questions hopefully answered. It just, oh my gosh, it just really, really was a lot to read. But I'm really glad that again, especially because those, what he wrote him is in this book, and what text wrote back is in this book. So you get a lot of information there, but oh my God, it was just really, so yeah, just as you can kind of see, as I kind of talk throughout the review, there are just different waves of emotions that I had with different parts of the book. And I have a little review on that at the end, but you can kind of see I've mentioned some of that as I've gone through, right? Some anger that I've had, some, inspiration that I've read from some parts. This part was just very, very sad. So prosecutor Stephen K. He also concurred and agreed that Jay's actions were heroic, quote, and executive of his true character, end quote. So another quote that was in there from Stephen K. was, quote, Jay was a very brave man. He loved Sharon. He was not going to let anything happen to her if he could at all help it. If something happened to Sharon, it was going to be over his dead body. And that's exactly what happened, end quote. And again, my note under that was just such an emotional part to read that. Just, yeah, really sad. So now we are at the morning, and this part, some of it, a lot of people might know if you've read the case, that Winifred Chapman, the housekeeper, so she arrived for work around 8:30 in the morning, and she was the one that came across the scene. Within 10 minutes, half a dozen police cars made their way to the home. Law enforcement, when they arrived, they first came across Stephen Parent. Wojciech was then discovered. Abigail Folger was found on the lawn, and law enforcement came across Sharon in the living room along with Jay. The book lists the evidence collected at the crime scene. Again, it does go into that in detail. In William Garrison, he was in the guest house. Police handcuffed him and took him down to the police station. He was, so a different William now, William Tennant. So he was Roman's business agent, and he arrived to the house around noon. He was actually supposed to be playing tennis that morning, but was summoned to come to Cielo Drive. He had the task of identifying the bodies of Sharon, Abigail, Wojciech, and Jay. He was also the one who later called Roman to inform him of Sharon's death, which I know the way some of how the law enforcement handled this, a lot of mistakes were made. I think that's being very kind in how this case was investigated and how the crime scene was handled, I should say. But I'm thinking, like, he was the one to call Roman? Like, where was law enforcement being the one to first make that call? But that was just kind of a me note. I'm like, wait, what? All right. So the thing with this murders, as we all kind of, have read through this, was that this wasn't the type of thing that happened in upscale parts of Los Angeles. So this was something that the media and news reporters were going to completely kind of gravitate to. And right away, comments from the media or people, saying that the murders appeared to be, quote, ritualistic, end quote, mentioning that two bodies were connected by rope, mentioning how bodies were discovered, estimating time of death, that some of the men, Jay and Wojciech, were dressed in hippie clothes, just all these statements being made to the media, by the media, of things that were just not true. So with that comes a lot of inferences, right? So think of some of the descriptions we just gave. That would give the inference to the public that drugs were most likely involved for the motive of the killings. In my note here, so unprofessional. So unprofessional. So the book says that the only information that the LAPD held was the name of the victims, and that was until they notified families. So news of what happened instantly hit the radio and television media. Jay's uncle, Lieutenant Colonel Gibb heard Jay's name in the reports. He immediately called his sister and the family in Detroit to tell them what happened. My note here again, like this was just such an emotional part to read, where Peggy and Tony DiMaria were working at a salon in Las Vegas when they found out the news. And Peggy says, quote, "It was like time stopped. I never felt such helplessness," end quote. Oh my gosh, just again, one of those parts where as the reader, you just feel totally gutted reading that. Little Joe was at his shop working when the news came over the radio, and he said, quote, "I was cutting hair and the radio comes on, a bulletin. And the boy said, Sharon and others murdered or dead. I knew Jay was there, and it bothered me because they said and others. He wasn't and others. He was my friend," end quote. And again, my note there was just like such an emotional thing to like, it's just so heart-wrenching because it's those intimate moments of like finding out that your loved one passed away and like that initial thought. And it's being shared in here for us to read. It very, very emotional to read that. Dean McClure, a Sebring stylist, says when he found out, quote, "Then they told me and I just lost it. His death is still painful, surprisingly, but it is," end quote. There are several, I mean, this just goes to show there are so many more quotes. So much more quotes here, and I'm just pulling pieces from it, but it's just, I want to make sure that I mention a lot of these because it just really goes to show like the impact that this news had on so many that were so close to Jay and just how gut-wrenching that moment was, right? So Warren Beatty, actor and director, said, quote, "This hit the movie community very deeply. On a 10-point scale, it disturbed me around a 27, end quote. Robert Wagner stated, quote, "Here was this young man who had this tremendous future and was just obliterated in a second. A man like Jay Sebring does not come along very often into this world. He had a particular gift, and he was taking it at a very young age when he didn't have to be," end quote. Nancy Sinatra said that she took time like processing it for days, and that was initially delayed because her body just shut down. Just that's not an uncommon response in regards to, again, went to school for psychology, so psychology nerd, that, you know, in regards to like the steps of grief and kind of what the body goes through, like just psychologically shutting down is not uncommon. So to read that, it was just like, oh gosh, oh my gosh. But yeah, right when that was mentioned, I was like, oh yes, I remember learning about that. Okay. Linda Lee Cadwell said of her and her husband, Bruce Lee, quote, "He reflected on the fragility of life and how we're going to and how we're just going along, and then the next day somebody can be gone," end quote. Steve McQueen, we've talked about him quite a bit in this book because he was so instrumental and important and close to Jay. So again, he was one of Jay's best friends. So he took this very, very personally and just upsetting. He started carrying a personal handgun on him at all times. In addition, he forced his wife to carry one as well. He installed a closed gate monitor on the front gate of his home. So the author then talks about, after a lot of these quotes are given from those who knew and loved Jay best, the impact that this had on the community. Gun shops being, sold out. Sporting goods store saw a record number of sales. Guard dogs being, dogs being adopted from the pound. Back then they were called the pound. And then guard dog rentals tripled in cost overnight. I was like, I don't think I've ever heard of a guard dog rental. But nonetheless. So the author then says, and this was one quote again that like right when this quote happened at the end of this chapter, it just really set up right away where the reader knew what was going to kind of unfold as the book continues. Quote, but it was nothing compared to what was about to happen to Jay's legacy. End quote. So, all right, just time check where we are. Yeah, I told you I have a lot of notes tonight. I have a lot of notes. So, the authors explain in the next chapter, because again, I just kind of set that up. And as humans, we attempt to explain what we don't understand. And when it isn't possible, we try to rationalize this. So this is so common. It still happens. So this isn't unique to 1969. It is still so common here. And not just with crimes of this magnitude, but because of the horrific overkill of violence here, and it occurred in a safe neighborhood, everybody wants answers. They want to rationalize it. So one way to do that, and this was happening here, was, how do you separate yourself from the victims so that it's not as close to home? Instead of, well, gee, it happened to them, it could happen to me. People don't want to think that. I could get into a whole psychology talk on that right now, but I won't. But so what we were seeing here is, if we separate ourselves, then, what happened to them? Yeah, it won't happen to me. I wasn't, very different, right? And some of the things that were being said as to why they were attacked: possible satanic cult, rituals, witchcraft, a drug deal gone bad, infidelity, jealous lovers, or even an orgy gone wrong. So these are all kind of listed as possible things that were being discussed, right? And it's just like bullshit. It's just bullshit, but nonetheless, and we still see that to this day. A lot of people will separate themselves from a lot of these horrific things so that if they think they are safer, because, well, I don't do X, Y, and Z, and that might have been why that happened to them. So what happened to them won't happen to me, type of thing. So Time Magazine, in their August 22nd, 1969 magazine piece. So what happened is that piece provided grisly details of what the victims had suffered, and it included some quotes by Los Angeles County Coroner Thomas Noguchi. Some of the description was of the violence, and it was completely absurd and actually inaccurate. And the book has a paragraph in here quoting this. And it was just like, my note was just like, what the hell? Like, how? So one of the podcasts that I listen to is Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. And Joseph Scott Morgan is a key at CrimeCon. I've been very fortunate to meet him the last several years I've been there. And one of the things that he talks about on his podcast is, when you're in that role as, county coroner or chief medical deputy examiner, forensic pathologist, regardless of the title that you have, you keep your mouth shut. You don't go to the media and say, here's this, here's this, here's this. Because when it goes to court, if there's any, slight detail, you've now already put something out there. And if you change, it's a credibility thing. And that's just one of the things he talks about constantly, is like with some of these cases where coroners will make comments and then the trial comes and it's like, oh, no, well, that's different than what you said to the public. And it's just such a bad, slippery slope. So when I read that he was, quoting something to the magazine, I was like, oh my God, no. But then again, so much of what was done in this case, of how it was handled, was not done properly. And this is just one of those examples of that, right? So the magazine also engaged in character assassination of all of the victims. So in addition to, again, Thomas Noguchi saying things in there that were completely absurd and inaccurate, the magazine is also completely just victimizing, re-victimizing and re-traumatizing the victims with false information. It stated Abigail was an aimless heiress, that Wojciech was a free-spending Polish refugee and hanger-on, The Polanskis, quote, habitually picked up odd and savory people indiscriminately and had as much idea about security as idiots, end quote. Yeah, you heard that right. It said Jay, quote, a diminutive men's hairstylist, was a health nut with violent convictions, kept guns in his glove compartment and an assortment of whips handy in his purple and black bedroom. An old girlfriend who said Sebring often had to tie her up for whippings reported he also smoked marijuana, end quote. Like, what the heck? What the heck? Yep, that happens. Wild. Again, as I mentioned a little earlier, like different parts of the book, like, getting fully just absorbed from the reader perspective. I get to that point and I'm like, I'm just outraged reading that. So the book talks about next how Roman Polanski, again, he learned that his wife was murdered. So he now returned back to the United States from London. He was met with law enforcement. He made several statements that piqued the interest of law enforcement during their conversation. And he was open with law enforcement that since Sharon's passing that he had been with many women, with several women. And reading that, I'm just like, what? Yeah. Another thing that Roman had told law enforcement, and it was not true, was that Jay was in debt. And this kind of made it sound like Jay would have been a likely target because of, if he was in debt, he was dealing with shady underground characters and so on. But again, that was not true. The book included a quote from Roman that he told detectives about Jay being involved in a drug thing or drug delivery. In the story about Roman going to see his dentist, who was also Jay's dentist. And then Roman says, yeah, the dentist was telling me that Jay owed him $5,400. So again, why were these being said? And I have a note here, there was a footnote after this in the book that wants to clarify that according to Jay's probate records, he was worth $339,000 at the time of his death. So that amount in 2025 would be equal to $3,013.85. So my note, again, this shouldn't have been a footnote. This was really huge information. I felt it should have been like with everything, like just right there, just shoot down and just put down what Roman was saying because it's not true. But nonetheless, again, that's why reading the footnotes in this book, y'all, so important, every single page, because that's huge information. It completely contradicts what Roman was saying. So one of the things, so I mentioned how Roman was very open with law enforcement in regards to how he'd been with other women since Sharon passed. He also talked to law enforcement about Jay's sex life and relationship with Sharon. And then one of the quotes in here after that was, quote, perhaps this was Polanski's way of belittling Jay and convincing himself that he was the main love of Sharon's life. I just have right there for my note for that, just a whole bunch of clapping emojis. I'm like, yes, spot on, spot on. And what I don't like is in my note for this next part that I'll read to y'all, my classic overcompensation. That's my note for this. And again, because the book talks about, Roman was saying, oh yeah, we're all friends. Me, Sharon, and Jay, are friends. But Roman has so many bad things to say about Jay. So he says, quote, he was just hanging around in some. Sometimes Sharon would resent him staying too long. He was always the last to leave, I'm sure that at the beginning of this relationship, there was still love from Sharon, etc. But I think that gradually it disappeared. I'm quite sure of it. And in my mind, when I learned of this, the tragedy and Maybe Sharon's being pregnant brought back in his mind, but I'm quite positive there was nothing from his part, not from Sharon's. But Sharon was as much in love with me as much as a human could be, you know, end quote. Yeah, classic overcompensation. Like, there's so much there to pick apart from what Roman was saying, but that's like a whole other conversation in itself. But it's just, yeah, clearly just overcompensation there. I think that's enough said. So the next part in the book, I'm not going to get into detail with that, is the LaBiancas, Rosemary and Lena LaBianca. So the LaBiancas murdered. Their murders are described here in detail. Again, I will not go really heavily into that. So once that is discussed by the authors, the book's just very upfront with saying Hollywood basically turned their back on the victims, including friends. Being associated with the crimes on any stigma is connected to the killings for sure. That would be, you know, ending to their reputation or their celebrity, you know, status. It could be, you know, career ending and, you know, celebrity status. Being associated with this could be a bad thing, right? So Steve McQueen, so he stated on his deathbed that Jay was his best friend. Even he would disassociate himself at this time from Jay. In a 1969 Pageant magazine article, so the same year that Jay was murdered, Steve said, quote, "I don't dig that weird scene," end quote. So one of the things that, so Steve had sent himself, kind of separated himself from Jay in an interview with police also shortly after the murders. Specifically, when law enforcement brought up the subject of Jay's drug habit, possible involvement with bondage, what Steve said was, quote, "Warren Beatty would know more about that side of Jay than anybody else, and possibly the drug angle," end quote. So again, we talked about earlier in the book this, you know, great friendship that Jay and Steve McQueen had, but now he is even, at least to the public, disassociating himself from Jay. And it's just so sad because, yeah, as the authors say, like everybody, including friends, were turning their back on the victims. And it's just horrible. It's absolutely horrible to read that. Even Sammy Davis Jr. had made some statements as well. A footnote in here that the author provides was that Jay and Sammy had a falling out in the mid-1960s after Sammy hit on Jay's wife, Cammy. She turned him down, and that was a whole issue. But again, so Cammy was just like, "I'm turning you down because I'm married to Jay and you're Jay's friend." Again, that was a footnote where I was just like, oh, that should be in the book, like in the rest of the book and not another footnote. But because I just thought it was so important to, like, okay, here's Sammy Davis Jr. again, making comments against his friend, but you were hitting on your friend's, like, wife, you know. Let's see. Writer, Joe, and I probably mispronounced this earlier, Joe Himes, a friend of Jay and Sharon. Remember, he was the one that introduced them in 1964, and he remained close to them right up until the end. Even he turned on them in death. So in his memoir, Joe describes the morning after the murders to the editor of a German news magazine. So, and this was really angry to read. So he gave some statements to this article, First Magazine. They kind of wanted a quick story and they were going to pay a lot of money. And Joe said yes. So what Joe stated was that all of the rumors about Sharon and Jay were killed by a hired killer. The two were victims of a bad drug deal, you know, participating in a sex scene, you know, a magic ritual, and that the murders were committed by people who knew Sharon and Jay. And he even said, and this was just like so infuriating, he even said that Sharon and Jay brought, quote, "the tragedy on themselves," end quote. That was their friend. Their friend Joe made that statement to this magazine. Like, what the heck? Like, again, When the authors say that everybody, not just Hollywood, but those friends even turned their back on the victims, they did. And it's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. So Dr. Michael Baden, back in here, he said when reviewing the autopsies, comparing it to the 1969 Time magazine article, two different realities, which is really great to hear that because, again, Dr. Michael Baden, respect his work. So Time magazine putting out here, here's what happened to the victims. It did not match up to the actual autopsies. So there was different views of the murders. And the way the book describes it was that one is that if we make the victims kind of more and more stranger in storytelling, there's less to kind of identify of them. And again, we talked about this earlier. And if we separate ourselves far enough, what happened to them? Well, it couldn't happen to me. On the flip side, there was another narrative that beautiful people were punished for all of their attractive attributes and success. That's still something we see today in 2025, which is just horrific. But I see more so in what the authors provide in this book of the kind of distancing so that what happened to them would not happen to me. That's kind of where I kind of see more of what was happening. So, and then for what it's worth, and again, this was a footnote in there, Sharon and Jay did not have drugs in their system at the time of their deaths, according to the official autopsy reports. So this whole drug thing, there was no drugs in their system. There was none. So now we are at a little further in the book. And again, this was for myself as a reader, a bit more of an emotional part of the read, because now we've gone through what happened to the victims and kind of how Hollywood and their friends turned their back on them as well. What's left? The families, the victims' families. In this chapter, so it's chapter 28 specifically, talks about Jay's family and how they dealt with the aftermath. The parents, they didn't have anybody they could talk to who could understand the grief of what they went through. So Gwen reached out to Jay's parents by writing them a letter. And that letter is in this book, and it is heartbreaking to read, heartbreaking. Again, it's not lost on me that the Sebring, Jay's family shared that in here. It's again, just such an emotional, personal thing that they were willing to share in this. That was not lost on me in here. So December 1st, 1969, the families learned that the Los Angeles police announced that, quote, the family, end quote, was responsible for the murders. And then it kind of goes through the trial. I won't get very heavily into that at all, but that is here in the book as well. So during the trial, just some notes here, Susan Atkins' attorney in his cross-examination asked about Sharon's involvement with Jay in regards to how she knew him. With Jane, interviews Jane, how well she knew him, if he attended parties, consumed drugs or alcohol with them. The attorneys also asked if Jay Sebring used a whip on someone in a sexual way, but the judge cut off the questioning from Susan Atkins' attorney with his gravel, saying cross-examination was over. But nonetheless, the jury still heard it. Other people in there still heard it. So unfortunately, Paul Tate, when he exited the courtroom, he was greeted by a ton of reporters, again, asking insensitive questions about Sharon. And one of the things about that that's so frustrating is that was in, over 5 decades ago. That still happens today. It still happens today. And it's just there's some things with time. It's have we not learned anything? But nonetheless. So let's see. The book talks about those who lost loved ones to the Manson family. violence, they kind of put their grief on hold because the trial is going underway and they had to witness like the circus of a trial, right? What was unfolding in the courtroom. And the book goes a lot more into those things. But again, trying to deal with their trauma and emotion from this and having to witness that, it just was not a good combination. In the meantime, going back to Sharon and Jay, their funerals were held on the same day, just hours apart. And one of the things that I didn't know this part when I read it in the book, I was like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? 20th Century Fox sees the opportunity of re-releasing Valley of the Dolls nationwide, and it coincided with the date of Sharon's funeral. I did not know that, and I read that and was just like, that is horrific, like horrific. So, and I know we're over 2 hours in, but we're getting there, folks. We're getting there. There's a lot to go over here. So in regards to Jay's services, so his family flew out to Los Angeles to attend his funeral service, except his mother, Margaret, was unable to attend due to some health issues. So she stayed back home with her daughter, Geraldine, to take care of her. So Anthony DiMaria, who he was only 3 years old at the time, he recounts in the book what that is like, what it was like at that time. And I encourage everyone to read the book for this passage. I'm not going to quote it. It's just, I can't do it just. But even just me re-saying it, like it won't, it's so much more powerful in here. But one thing that did strike me from what Anthony was saying was kind of looking back to see his parents and grandparents work so hard to protect Anthony and his sisters from everything that was going on and impacted their family. Like they really tried to keep that from them as best they could. And one of the things that they always tried to instill that Anthony talks about in this book is to remind him that Jay wouldn't want them to suffer any more than what is natural, and to remind to live life with passion and the zeal that Jay did. But this was one of the themes that kind of struck me here, because it was something throughout that we read about Jay throughout the entire book about his life. Passion, like living with passion. He did that throughout the entire book. You read that, you feel that throughout the entire book. So for Anthony to be 3 years old at this time and to kind of be told that, and then growing up and constantly, being told like Jay wouldn't want this, live life with passion the way he did. It was just such a theme in this. And that again was one of those just sad things to read, but then also inspiring. And then also on top of that, the strength of Anthony's parents and grandparents and family to, again, try to protect the grandkids like Anthony and, as best they could, which with this case being as public as it was, it just, I can't even imagine. So in regards to Jay's business, so there's a lot of really good information on this and kind of the aftermath of the business, which is everything that's been out there in the media the last over 50 years is not fully accurate. But in here, it talks about kind of very briefly how Bernard now had to find a successor to keep Jay's dynasty running. And that was not easy. So Jim Markham was one of the shop workers who stated Jay had told him while they were in New Mexico that if anything ever happened to him, he should take over the business because he's the only one that knows how to do it. So the news about when the murders happened, Jim was at the shop in New Mexico, and about an hour later, he received a phone call from a John Madden, vice president of Sebring. And John decided to promote Jim to his position at Sebring, Los Angeles. So a few days before Jim arrived in Los Angeles to take over, Bernard actually sent him a very positive letter. It was a very kind letter dated August 28, 1969, and that letter is in this book. So when Jim came to the salon, he didn't come to it in LA to just kind of take over and run it, but he would inherit Jay's 400 plus client list. And he bought and drove Jay's Porsche, and he even slept in Jay's house, which I was just like, that's a little, I don't know. I didn't know how to feel about that. But when Jim arrived, he brought into Joel's old office. He was brought in by John Madden. John told him that the phones are bugged by the FBI and that one of the stylists was suspected of the murder. Again, because at this time, the real killers had not been caught yet. So of course, rumors running rampant. So of course it's, the phones must be bugged by the FBI. So that was being kind of put into Jim's mind when he came. So in addition to all of Jay's responsibilities at the shop that Jim had to take over, this included overseeing the Sebring product lines, setting up distributions, meeting with new buyers, and fielding calls from the press. So there was a lot that Jim had to do. And on December 2nd, 1969, which happened to be the day after the LAPD announced they arrested suspects in the murders, Jay's parents attended an event at the LA Factory nightclub where Jim was officially and publicly announced as the Sebring business president. Jim taking over, it was not a smooth transition. So little Joe had stayed in touch with several of the shop workers, even though he now had his own shop and was running that. And Joe talks about how things just seemed to fall apart without Jay. Quote, with Jay no longer around to hold it all together, it all eventually fractured and fell apart, end quote. Which was just, and again, it just goes, to me in my mind, goes back to how Jay managed the shop. Again, it just sticks with me. You're not here to work for me. Like, we're here to work together. And that just has stuck with me throughout this book. So it's not surprising how without that central and such important and impactful person, it just would have started to kind of disintegrate. So one of the stylists at the salon had actually also convinced a handful of others to join him and open up a salon down the street. So they left and they did that. And once that shop opened, 4 more of those stylists from the Sebring shop left to join this new one. So again, it's just things kind of crumbling big time. After a year, the Sebring partners defaulted on numerous months of rent, and this put a huge burden on Jay's parents. It was a huge financial burden to have put on them. So in May 1971, Bernard filed for bankruptcy. So this is where there's a kind of few different things in the book. And again, where reading the footnotes here is so important. So according to Jim, Jay's father abruptly filed. However, the author makes it clear that this was not abrupt. Bernard had been reminding the new management team of their financial delinquencies for quite a while, through at least a dozen letters. And one of those is in this book. So there's a footnote here that Jay's father maintained extensive notes and records in regards to Jay's estate, probate, and business enterprise throughout his life. So again, that was one of the footnotes where I thought that really should have been with, like, to me, kind of right under where the authors are making it clear that this wasn't abrupt, just to kind of solidify what Jim was saying about, oh, this just happened out of nowhere. Not true. Just not true. So Jay's family, they didn't just oversee things from a distance, right? Bernard had to fly to LA monthly regarding the rental arrears issue. Peggy and Tony DiMaria, along with their young kids, had offered to relocate to LA to work in and to oversee the salon to ensure the Sebring legacy. So it wasn't ideal, but they were already living in Las Vegas, and they really just wanted to help their parents, right? Margaret, however, told them, do not go to Los Angeles. So the DiMarias remained in Las Vegas per their parents' direction. So Jay's parents then decided to place the assets of their son's salons and the Sebring product line up for auction. At the time, this seemed like the best way to legally and physically protect Jay's family and, most importantly, Jay's legacy. There's a whole thing right here in this part of the book, which I actually had to kind of read through more than once to kind of be like, okay, I follow now. Because there's just a lot happening right now in regards to the legality of things. And it involves Jim Markham, Bob Papin, and Helen Nielsen. So again, it's about kind of bidding on the, Sebring salon and who they were. And there's just a lot intertwined here. And it's a very fascinating thing, but also just kind of like, sometimes people's true colors show, and you really kind of, as this part of the book unfolds, you're like, oh, yeah, not good intentions, not good intentions. So yeah, that's definitely a part to kind of, read through. One part here, about Jim. I just like some of my notes here. I'm just like, what the fuck? In regards to Jim, I'll just say he began packaging a grooming kit just like Jay had done. And he began to try to certify barbers in the Markham method. He was clearly using the business strategies he learned from Jay. And it was just like, what a slap in the face. My notes are like, what the fuck? It was just, again, range of emotions, like as the reader being so like invested in what you're reading, where you're just like, I'm so angry at this. Like, what the heck? Like, what the heck? But yeah, very, very important part of the book in regards to Jay's salon and his empire. However, even once you get through all of that and you really get to read about them, a few years after that, the Sebring salon closed. His empire eventually dissolved, except for the Sebring product line. The authors state that Jay's heirs do not have any ownership in the product line, nor have they received a dime of royalties since his death, which is like mind-boggling. Like, I guess from like when you read through like the legal aspect of it, you're like, well, okay, but then it just doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit right, which is really unfortunate. So we're kind of winding down, folks. We're winding down a little bit more. So on February 18th, 1972, the California Supreme Court, in a 6-1 decision, decided to abolish the death penalty. The court determined that the death penalty constituted cruel and unusual punishment. So at this point, through the kind of rest of the book, we're getting into clearly kind of now the parole options in hearings in regards to so many of them. And specifically, this meant that Manson family members behind bars for murder were now sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. So who are those people? Charles Manson, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Bruce Davis, and Bobby Robert Beausoleil. When this change happened in law, this was, to say devastating to the victims' families, just wouldn't even do it justice. Because think about it. I just mentioned a whole bunch of names. Each one of them would come up for parole, however many often, ever so, so many years. And that means for every single one of those times, for every single one of those individuals I just named, the victims' families had to relive what happened to their loved one. And they would have to face that in the back of their mind. There was a chance that their loved one's killer could be set free. So this next quote in the book was just spot on to describe this. Quote, "This parole purgatory has made it impossible for there to be any sense of real justice or the chance for the dead to rest in peace," end quote. When Jay's family learned of this, they contacted the California authorities. That's one of the things in here, that Jay's family does not just sit back with any of this. They, you know, especially even Anthony DiMaria, as we kind of go through kind of some of the parole hearings that will come up in this through the rest of this book, like such an advocate and a fighter, like anything that his family can do to prevent any of them from getting out, like full steam ahead, full steam ahead. So again, Jay's family contacted the California authorities. They were promised by representatives from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office and the Los Angeles Police Department that none of the Manson family members would ever actually be paroled. How do you promise that? Again, the family was promised none of them would actually get paroled. We kind of know what's going to happen in a few years, but at this time in the book, that's what they're being told. The authors then go into how parole hearings are, when they take place, and typically how many hours they can go for. And they give a lot of detail into this. And my note here was, I was not aware of all of this. And especially for how many hours they could go for, I was like, I had no idea. That is insane. That is my notes. But yeah, it's just such an insight into that process, because you constantly hear, even in now 2025, of somebody has a parole hearing, or parole hearing, but what does that mean? What is behind it? What does it entail? How long does it go? Like, you don't get that breakdown. If that breakdown is in here, the authors provide that so the reader knows exactly what that is. And I was not aware of all of that, so it was interesting to kind of learn that. So let's see. There's a quote in here from Anthony. It's almost a full paragraph. I won't read the whole thing, but it's basically, it was very, very spot on, because he basically describes how surreal it is and disturbing when you sit at a parole hearing year after year and kind of listen to all of the good things that the inmate has done. Like one of the examples here was the prison puppy program. And he goes, he lists all these things and says, but you're weighing that against the value of my uncle's life. Quote, "For decades, our families endure how the slaughters of our parents, children, siblings, our flesh and blood are reduced to a piece of paper or metal," end quote. And that's absolutely spot on. The book talks about also Bruce Davis's last parole hearing, specifically him doing an interview on the Lighter Side of Serial Killers podcast, and how a quote media observer was going to be present to observe the hearing. That's what the families were told for this one. Again, just a media observer. They were given minimal information. The next morning, the families were aware it was Sophia Arguelles, and the victims' families had a strong reaction to this. And they talk about that in this book, because, and Anthony makes it very clear in this, it's, yes, she is not responsible for what, her grandfather did, but it was also the way that it was kind of put to the victims in this. And yeah, spot on. There was just no transparency, which kind of, to me, says like, okay, those who kind of arranged this, like, they knew what they were doing, because why not just be transparent in the first place? So that was interesting for that, from, Anthony and the other victims' families' perspective of kind of how that unfolded. So in regards to Bobby Beausoleil, the book discusses his social media and websites. And again, DiMaria is not just sitting back, with any of this. He is fighting full force. And he points out the violations and what was interposed by attorney Jason Campbell. Bobby had said under oath that his website does not have links to other sites like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but that wasn't true. So that was pointed out. Anthony had filed a formal complaint to the CDCR, but before that was addressed, there was an issue regarding a decision on a habeas corpus regarding Bobby Beausoleil's parole hearings. And hear this is just wild. That no victim's family or representative could address in future hearings that Bobby's crimes were directly connected to the Tate LaBianca murders. So Bobby has confirmed, but that was the case though, and so did Susan Atkins. So the book states that not one member of the Hinman family was also informed of the legal proceedings for this, and that worked to Bobby's advantage. So again, it's just little things where it seems as the years went on, things weren't being transparent or disclosed to the victims' families where they really should have been, because it was a big deal. And it's another example of something that wasn't. So at this point, Bobby Beausoleil was granted suitable for parole, and Patricia Krenwinkel found suitable for parole on May 30th, 2025. We all kind of know where that ended up as of now, but in the context of this book, that was what was happening in real time. So Tex Watson, the book gets to him in regards to he's behind bars, and Anthony actually requested an interview for his documentary. And Tex responded in a letter from 2009. That letter's in this book. Tex's 2011 letter about now having a change of heart, because in 2009 he wanted to put this all behind him, but in 2011, 2 years later, had a change of heart and writes a letter. And one of the things that he asks of Anthony DiMaria is how the profits for the money will be distributed. And Anthony gives his response and perspective to that question in this book. And like my note here is just all like, what the heck, Anthony is spot on. Wild. Like, it was just like, I can't even imagine, Anthony and, his family and all the other victims' families trying to navigate this, and then to deal with like that level of bullshit on top of it. I'm just like, I can't even, like, I don't even know. It's like infuriating. As I'm reading this, I'm just infuriated. Which, I'm kind of winding down here with my notes, but that's one of the things that it just, to me, and I'll just make this point now, just really goes to show how well this book is written, that as the reader, you get fully just drawn in and invested with it. And that's one of the things I look for. Yeah, I'm an avid reader. I'm a book nerd. I'm a full-fledged book nerd. And I like to feel connected. I like to feel drawn in. And I get that with this book. And with that being said, as I'm reading, you go through those emotions right there with the author. And some of them it's just a wide range in this book, but it's just, to me, really shows how well that it's written, that you follow that and you feel so invested in it that you have those moments of just the up and down, the inspirational moments, the sad moments, the angry moments, and everything in between, right? So let's see. Anthony writes a text again in 2024, wanting to learn as much as he can about Jay. Tex did respond. Anthony had emailed him a bunch of questions about Jay's kind of last moments. And that is in this book. Anthony says that Tex says, quote, I genuinely wish I could grant let's see, that he wrote to, okay, sorry, no. Sorry, Anthony writes in the book to Tex saying, I genuinely wish I could grant forgiveness even just for what was done to me, but until the direct victims arise from their graves and grant their forgiveness, all is moot, end quote. So it was just, yeah, that's absolutely spot on, because yeah, Anthony kind of talks about how he kind of right before that was kind of feeling compelled to consider forgiveness of Tex, where he says, well, the individual might be forgiven, but not the crime. But then kind of is like, no, moot point, because, you know, the victims can't arise from their graves and grant forgiveness. And yeah, that's absolutely kind of spot on for that. And we see where so many different, families of such horrific crimes, there's no one mold kind of fits all, right? So we're just here with Anthony and kind of his truth and his journey and his experience and his feelings in this. And reading his, I'm just like, yeah, I completely agree with that. Completely agree with that. But again, to each their own. Everybody's journey is different. But yeah, you get Anthony's kind of raw, in the moment feelings about a lot of this as it unpacks, which on the one hand is just such a gift as well, for that vulnerability to be in this book, because yes, it's about Jay and his life and his legacy and his career, but Anthony and his family, especially Anthony in here, being so raw and open about, like, here's what our family's being, and here's what I'm feeling and thinking, and just laying it all out there. It's just such a vulnerable and raw position to put yourself in. And that's not lost on me, what is being given to the reader, which is just such an opportunity to learn that and to see that. Let's see. California implements the, kind of elderly parole program. Anybody who kind of has, followed me on this kind of knows kind of where I stand with that. So I'll just kind of leave that there. But yeah, y'all know I'm pretty mean with my kind of thoughts on kind of keeping people behind bars. So yeah. Let's see, the book kind of talks about, and this is one of the things that we've seen so much with, like, kind of where a lot of the killers have been able to lead lives behind bars. And that's discussed in this book. Some of them were able to get married more than once, write books, get college degrees, do national media interviews. So they're getting to lead these and even have children as well. And Anthony kind of responds that there are so many things that's disturbing to hear in parole hearings. And one of the kind of frustrating things is about kind of the cost efficiency. And that is one of the things that Susan Atkins, that was kind of addressed and brought up when kind of her health turned, and her husband, attorney at the time, James Whitehouse, tried to explain, what it was going to cost the taxpayers to keep her behind bars versus kind of like a compassionate release type of thing, right? But Anthony, yeah, I am right there with him, in agreement on that, where he's like, we're not here to balance the California state budget. Quote, "We are here because Susan Atkins sent several people to their graves. I find any talk of dollars and cents in this room inappropriate and gut-wrenching," end quote. Perfectly well said. Perfectly said. At Patricia Krenwinkel's 2016 parole hearing, the board had requested a judgment to initiate an investigation to determine if she was a victim of, quote, "intimate partner abuse," end quote, by Charles Manson. Anthony, again, not sitting back, immediately responds, talking about this development 47 years later, by the way, and saying how mind-boggling that this was coming up, right? Mostly because of the injustice by local authorities that impacted the victims' families. So he objected and wrote everything that he had issues with. from that parole hearing in a letter to the parole board. And part of that is in this book. And in the end, the authorities launched a formal investigation to determine, was Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten intimate partner abuse victims of Charles Manson? And in the end, both of them were found to be victims by the California Department of Corrections in the BPH. So December 7th, 2020, George Gascon became the 43rd District Attorney of Los Angeles County and assumed office. And this was when a whole bunch of stuff changed in regards to victims' families, and not in a good way. Not in a good way at all. And I'm not from California, so when I was reading this, I was not aware of the impact that this had on the victims' families. So when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, how did I miss that? How was I not aware that that was happening, right? And I'll briefly explain that here. So what George Gascon had put under his directive was that lead law enforcement authorities for justice and victims' rights were prohibited. Let me repeat that: prohibited from any involvement or presence at any Los Angeles County life or parole hearings. What does that mean to the victims' families? Well, the book says, this policy left thousands of victims' families of violent crimes left to fend for themselves with no legal representation from the county's office. Before, the prosecutor's office would notify victims of crime or next of kin of any upcoming parole hearing in advance. That was no longer happening. So, if you're thinking, well, wait a minute, it gets better. It gets better. Because part of a statement from George Gascon's office said, quote, contacting victims and their next of kin can be very triggering, especially if they do not welcome the intrusion, end quote. So just don't notify them at all. Like I'm reading this and I'm like, how did I miss this? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? It's just wild. So Anthony, again, does not kind of hold back. And now Leslie Van Houten, we talk. So she was recently paroled, as we all know, and that was brought up in this book. So Anthony talks about his impact victim statement from Leslie's parole hearing on September 6, 2017. Again, that's in this book. And part of what he discusses is that there's been this shift in parole hearings. What that means is, instead of what did you do, tell me about the crime, who are you today, what is different? Now they kind of look at a different way of it's more focused on kind of what we discussed earlier with like what accolades have you done? Like one of the examples earlier was like the puppy program, the this, the that, the medals, the this, the that. Things just really, really shifted and not for the good. So the focus on who are you today versus tell me about the crime, what did you do? Totally different. So Anthony took a same look when he responded at this parole hearing. He took those same questions. This was my note right here was like, this is everything that Anthony has done, kind of fighting back was incredible. This one to me out of the entire book just like stood out. And I was just like, oh my God. Like Anthony, amazingly well done to flip their own narrative back at them. So what Anthony did, again, he posed the same questions. He posed them to Rosemary LaBianca, to Lino LaBianca, and flat out saying to the commissioners, how can we make amends for Leslie Van Houten when none of us can make amends for her victims? It was just incredible. But we get to the next chapter in the book. And on May 30th, 2023, Anthony received an unexpected email, and it was about the appellate court ruling on Leslie Van Houten. Anthony took action immediately, trying to do everything he could, contacting everyone he could to prevent Leslie from being released. And that is discussed in this book, what he did. One of the things was he emailed Gavin Newsom and his representatives. Within 30 minutes of sending that email, Anthony received a phone call informing him that Gavin Newsom would not be filing an appeal to the California Supreme Court. This meant that Leslie Van Houten would most likely be released from prison. Anthony took it upon himself to immediately then email the victims' families, informing them of this. And then, as we know, on July 11th, 2023, Leslie Van Houten was released from prison. That same day, a CNN producer contacted Anthony to request a live interview that hearing to kind of hear a victim's perspective on her release. And in here, Anthony kind of writes about his initial response to that request. He does give the interview, and that is discussed in here. What stuck out to me from that interview was that he flat out said releasing Leslie Van Houten would be setting a dangerous precedent that will, not could, but will impact millions of families of filing crimes throughout the state of California. And my note here is Anthony's absolutely spot on with that. In regards to the initial one who started all part like this bullshit narrative that has been the best true crime book bestseller of all times, Vincent Bugliosi. Anthony talks about Vincent Bugliosi. That is in here. So loved reading his thoughts on that. And in regards to, I'll just kind of briefly say, in all of the interviews that Bugs has done throughout the years, Anthony talks about for several years, he reached out directly to Vincent Bugliosi to request an interview. Vincent declined and left him a voicemail. And Anthony puts that voicemail, like the script of that, typed the narrative of it in this book. It's worth a read. I'm telling you, it is worth a read. Anthony reaches out again. Vincent Bugliosi declines a second time, but he does not contact Anthony to decline. Who do you think he had do his work? His wife, Gail. She was the one to read him the message. That is in this book as well. And what Anthony says is absolutely spot on. He's the person who has generated millions of dollars, right? Vincent Bugliosi, millions of dollars in profit for his book, television deals, lectures, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews. Why would, and as Anthony says, why would the extremely successful high-profile Manson murder authority refuse to be involved in a story on Jay Sebring? Makes sense, right? The book also talks about Tom O'Neill and his book Chaos. Remember, we brought that up earlier and I said put a pin in that because we're going to be getting back to it. So again, Peggy and Anthony sat with Tom O'Neill and spoke to him about Jay. Even after that in-person interview, Anthony and Tom kept in touch. And when Chaos was released, nothing from that was in the book. And Anthony says, why would Tom O'Neill omit all of this insight from Jay's family in this book? And Deborah, Sharon's sister, also corresponded with Tom. That was also not in the book. So again, why would Tom O'Neill omit all of this insight from Sharon's family in the book as well, because especially Tom O'Neill wanted to do a book on the, kind of victims' perspectives, right? So why omit like Jay's family and Sharon's family? You have all that. Why not put that in your book, right? So the book also talks about Jim Markham in a July 30th, 2019 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, where Jim alleges in an article that Jay and Manson had nefarious dealings with each other, and that Jay attacked Manson the day before the murders, which we all know that's bullshit, because Manson was in Big Sur at this time. But Jim doesn't just leave it there. He's basically saying Manson had gone up to the house, wanted to sell cocaine and weed. He showed Jay and Wojciech the drugs. They were going to buy some of it, but they ended up beating him up at the gate. So the next night, Manson sent the family up to kill them. It was bullshit. Manson was never even there. He was in Big Sur. So why would Jim Markham, again, give this completely false narrative about that? So those who knew Jay were very adamant, quote, no way Jay was a drug dealer. Don't believe the press, end quote. There's an email Anthony does to The Hollywood Reporter, and that email's in this book, asking for a public apology and to make the appropriate corrections and to present a formal, complete, public, in its entirety, printed publicly. Anthony never received an apology from the publication or its authors, and there was no retraction to the article. So even with this, like, hey, this happened all this time ago where you reported this, that's false. Please retract that. Nothing, no response at all. And one of the things that says right in this part is, quote, it has now become part of the Jay Sebring narrative, end quote. So let's see. All right, my last couple of points. So one of the paragraphs at the very, very end of the book, and I put this was an emotional paragraph as well. The way it kind of ended was, quote, after more than 5.5 decades of negative publicity and dark mythology, Jay's family has been left to wonder why history has been so unkind to their beloved son, brother, uncle. Would he forever remain obscured as he lay in his grave? Or would Jay Sebring, the man who lived life to the fullest and made a positive impact on American culture, ever be known in his true form? End quote. So the epilogue of the book, there is a paragraph in here that was so spot on. It now, like, reading that part after the end of the book, this epilogue just really, I felt, left the reader in a more positive, kind of uplifting look and feel about Jay's life. So what it says is, quote, though Jay Sebring was taken out of the game too soon, his influence lives on. Too much emphasis has been placed on how Jay died, and our goal is to reveal to new generations how he lived, because living well and living with intention was his great purpose and what he wanted to offer the world. Our aim is to bring to light just how great and lasting his impact has been. You may have come to this account of Jay's life only knowing he was a Manson family victim. Perhaps you didn't even know that much. But his legacy has touched everyone, and his story, now accurately related, can serve as inspiration for many more generations of dreamers like Jay, end quote. Just such a positive, uplifting way to kind of close out the book after all of the, again, ups and downs of emotions. Reading this, being so drawn into this was just a really, really, like, I can't even, like, the way the authors, the their artistic choice to close the book with that epilogue was just brilliant. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So I just gave a whole lot of kind of talking through the book and kind of interjecting a little bit with like my thoughts here and there. We're almost at 3 hours, folks. As much information as we just discussed, there is so much more in this book, so much more. So to wrap up my takeaways, just very, very briefly. So the book going into detail of the history and what it was like at certain times gave great detail and perspective to the reader. There were so many people that spoke so fondly of Jay that was really cool to see that and to read that from those who knew and loved him, right? One of the other things I took away was that Jay really also not only was trying to go forward with his career and do what he wanted to do in his field, but he also was there to boost and help up other people with their career. And we see that with Little Joe. Part of Jay succeeding was his team and his friends and family succeeding too. And we really get to see that. And that was really cool. One of the notes here was that I felt like I got to know Jay. There's no book like this where there's so much about Jay. He's either kind of mentioned here and there in different, Manson related books, but the focus isn't on the victims the way this book is about Jay and his life. And I think of somebody going into this who, maybe has heard of the case or maybe they haven't. I felt at the end of this, the way the authors and, especially Anthony giving so much kind of private family letters, photos, feelings into the book, like you really, as a reader, felt you walked away and thought, I know so much more about Jay now, and I didn't know that before. And that was really powerful from the authors to be able to accomplish that so well to the readers. It was great to kind of read this outside of the kind of quote unquote typical narrative that we've been hearing for over 5 decades. In the book really shut down a lot of the bullshit that has been out there for, again, over these 5 decades. It was really great to read about Jay's hard work, his pre-success, his success, and then where he was wanting to continue to grow again with like his product line and opening so many more salons and kind of staffing those. So you got to really see like the whole picture. He didn't just wake up one night and have all the success given to him. Like, no, it was blood, sweat, and tears, hard work. And he accomplished that through that. In regards to feelings, I kind of mentioned that as I was kind of going through it with you guys, there was just so many emotions of how the authors were so really able to give that and do the right kind of artistic choice to make the reader really feel the emotions that they're writing about and trying to evoke. So again, reading, going along where I felt those moments of, anger, of frustration, of profound sadness, of inspiration and whatnot. Jay's story in itself is inspirational, and it's just one of those things where I'm glad that the book ended on that inspiring kind of feeling. It just was a really positive thing to do, and I thought that was brilliant artistic choice for that. Once I put the book away, because I've read it more than once, and I felt this throughout both times of my reading it, that even though it ended in like a really positive, uplifting way, I still felt profound sadness. And what I mean by that is Jay accomplished so much, and then his life was cut short. And I just felt like how much more he could have done, and just sadness for that he didn't get that opportunity, and that the world was robbed of that as well. Like he could have done so much more. And it really is our loss that that happened. And it's just, I feel like you hear that sometimes when people talk about, musicians who passed away, so earlier, or actors or comedians that passed away so early. It's like, oh, here's what they were, but like, what could have been? And it kind of, I feel that kind of same type of mindset, like with so much of everything that Jay accomplished, like what more could have been? Because I don't see, from kind of reading how he wanted to do X, Y, and Z and change the world and change things, I don't see how he would have gotten to a point and been like, done. Like, I just felt he would have kept growing and kept evolving and trying to change things more and more as he was getting more into his craft. There would have been so much more that could have been done and should have been done. And we were all robbed of that, and he was too. And that's just, again, I just felt really profound sadness in thinking that. Let's see. Another takeaway I had was, again, I have shout out to Anthony for not only just wanting to learn about his uncle for himself, but to then share that with everyone. And regardless of the place where it came from, because again, the family's been up against like the bullshit narrative and like all the lies and just everything for over 5 decades. But to, again, just put such a raw and vulnerable opening into him and his family's life and into Jay's, it's just so, I'm just so grateful that Anthony wanted to share that with all of us. And one of the things that I kind of sticks out to me is, not everything is kind of sunshine and, and flowers and whatnot. There were a lot of hard times, and not every moment was, happy. Things were hard, and there was a lot of disagreements. And, even with Jay and his father's relationship, there was a lot of, there was friction because, at how they kind of, especially as, when Jay was growing up, kind of went back and forth. But then as an adult, you grow out of that. But to put those moments in there, people don't always want to put out the not so great times, right? But Anthony was very upfront of like, here's my family, and here's the history with everything, and he just laid it all out on the table. And I commend him for that, because again, not everybody likes to put every detail. It's like, yeah, we'll put all these great things, but we'll just shy away from the not so great. No. Anthony just laid everything out for the reader. And again, just to be able to get all of that, like, especially even like the letters, that the back and forth with Jay and his family, and just such prized private moments that was shared with us. Again, that's not lost on me. And it's, as a reader, I just felt very grateful for that insight into having those things to read and the pictures to see from the private family photos. Yeah, the footnotes, again, my note with like some of those footnotes, I mean, again, people do not skip the footnotes. And a lot of them I was like, oh, this should be right there with the book. Like, not as a footnote, because this is great information that could stand alone as is. Lastly, yeah, I'd like to learn about Jay and in all aspects of his life from those who knew him. And that was totally accomplished in this book. Everything that the author set out in their description page that I mentioned at the beginning, completely accomplished in this book. And I recommend this book to everyone, absolutely to everyone. Again, it is over 500 pages, so it is a bit of a long read. I mean, I'm the type, your girl is a book nerd, and I will just, if I have 5 hours to just sit and read at once, I will do it, because I love that. And this is an easy read in regards to you're able to sit and just keep reading and reading. It's not set up in a way where it's too complex to do that. The only kind of hesitation I have with that is because of the nature of what is being discussed in here. There are some parts, like I think especially where you get to kind of the more violence and the actual murders and what was committed, it might be too much where, you might get a few chapters in and you're like, all right, I mentally just kind of need to pause right now because what I just took in was a lot emotionally from the authors. And then you pick it up at the next day or whatnot. But it's a good, really good read. And there's, again, so over 80, I believe my note was 80 something pictures of photos, which was just incredibly generous in here. Nope, sorry, 68 pages of black and white photos, which is amazing from the family to provide that. So that is my review, almost 3 hours on the dot review of Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth by Marshall Terrill and Anthony DiMaria. So I mentioned stay to the end because I have an announcement. So for those of you who did stay to the end, thank you. And I will do a post. I will do an official post. But on November 20th, stay tuned in. Make sure you watch because the authors will be here live on Danny After Dark. So that is correct. On November 20th, Marshall Terrill and Anthony DiMaria will be here to discuss this book. And I'm really, really excited and honored to have them on to be able to discuss this. In addition, that guy, Paul from the Paulcast, he'll be here too. But yeah, we can, it's fine. It's fine. Marshall. Hi, Marshall. Oh my gosh. Anthony and I are so looking forward to talking with you. Oh my gosh. Thank you for being here in the chat. I am so looking forward to having you guys on. Paul, yeah, it'll be fine having one too. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I am so looking forward to that as well because I honestly feel like as much as I discussed, I feel like I didn't discuss much at all at the same time. So again, that will be on November 20th. So everybody stay tuned for that. So it'll be me, Marshall Terrill, Anthony DiMaria, and Paul from the Paulcast. So stay tuned for that. Thank you. That really means a lot. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So in the meantime, if anybody has any questions or comments, this video will stay up. Leave a question, leave a comment. I will get back to you before they come on for November 20th. If you have not already, pick up a copy of this book. And I would say read through the whole thing as best you can. But I think it will give also, as much as I've talked about, this will give a great insight into regards to when Marshall and Anthony are on. If you've read the book, I think you might be able to kind of, maybe there's some things in there that, I missed or that kind of stuck out to you that I didn't discuss in this which would be great for Marshall and Anthony to kind of go over. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, we are going to wrap this one down for tonight. James Watson, I see your photo that the picture is, yeah. That's what happens when you have multiple cats and they just paw at everything. It kind of gets a little tilted. I'm just going to leave it just to annoy you. All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining me for this review of Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth by Marshall Terrill and Anthony DiMaria. And stay tuned on November 20th when Marshall and Anthony, as well as Paul from the Paulcast, come on for a live interview and talk about the book. So have a great rest of your evening, everybody. And remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.